or 21 Celsius possible. Mid to high teens elsewhere, so very mild for many. Temperatures well above average for the time of year. Clear spells continue then for many overnight, but further showers will affect central and western Scotland as well as Northern Ireland for a time. Outbreaks of rain move in by the end of the night across southern England and South Wales. And wherever you are, it's going to be a mild night, but not quite as mild across parts of northern and eastern England, Scotland and Northern Ireland. 4 to 7 Celsius here under any clear spells. A few mist and fog patches first thing. They'll disappear fairly quickly because it will get breezy and increasingly cloudy once again from the south. Now that breeze bringing gales into coasts of western England and West Wales, and outbreaks of rain arriving into southern Scotland, Northern Ireland by the afternoon. But brighter skies once again return in the south. 22 or 23 Celsius in the southeast where we get some sunshine, and once again high teens for many elsewhere. But it's an unsettled picture as we end Saturday across Scotland, northern England into parts of Northern Ireland. The rain clearing north, but further showers affecting parts of central and western England as well as Wales. Sunday looks like a showery day, especially towards the northwest, some heavy downpours in places. Monday and Tuesday, more wind and rain.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch.
You've been cancelled. Join the club.
Oh, my goodness me. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
We are GB News.
And we'd like to say thank you
to each and every one of you
for helping our great nation
find its voice.
We're absolutely everywhere.
Across England, Scotland,
Wales and Northern Ireland.
On TV,
on radio and online.
We're proud to be
the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
On the Mark Steyn Show, we cover the stories a lot of people are scared even to mention. The stuff that really matters with some of the world's biggest thinkers.
Now is his opportunity to kind of take the steering wheel of history.
Break away from the flop at 8 o'clock on GB News with the Mark Steyn Show.
Every Saturday at 2 o'clock, join me, Darren Grimes, for Real Britain. I'm not afraid to give you a platform and say it how it is.
Come on, make the case.
Something like this is very, very important to people.
And we're always up for a laugh on this show.
God, honestly, you'd think there were no problems in the world.
Real Britain, every Saturday on GB News.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events, and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debates, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
Hello, it is exactly midday. Welcome to GB Newsday with me, Alastair Stewart. Coming up today, from new King Charles coins to the autumn statement and stealth taxes. We'll be looking at your money today. Plus, our People's poll suggests that you now trust the Tories more with the economy than Labour, but you still quite fancy a Labour government. And was Revolver re-released the best ever Beatles album? And was Taxman one of the best protest songs ever recorded? Your thoughts welcome on all of the above and more. But first, let's bring you right up to date with the news. Here's Alice. No, we'll have the news in a moment. I do beg your pardon. It's all kicking off in Northern Ireland as Stormont has failed yet again to reconvene, which means it's missed the deadline set by Westminster to get its parliament back up and running. This means that another election is on the horizon as the protocol continues to cause chaos. We will bring you the very latest on this throughout the programme. And Prime Minister Rishi Sunak has almost completed a week in Downing Street. Ruffling feathers already, he's pulled out of the COP27 climate summit with, quotes, other pressing commitments on his plate. Plus, his appointment of Suella Braverman as Home Secretary after she allegedly committed multiple data breaches has caused a bit of a ruction. And it is official. Tesla billionaire Elon Musk has completed his Twitter buy-up. Begging the question, what will become of the social media giant, given what's happening to social media generally in the marketplace? Will it become a platform of free speech, as Mr. Musk promised? Will Trump be allowed back on? Well, according to Mr. Musk, the bird has been freed, so let's see what all of that entails. And please don't forget to email or tweet what you think about it. We'll share the best as the programme progresses. What do you think about the topics discussed today? You can email gbviews@gbnews.uk. And now we are not going to the news, but we are going to the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, who has been giving a pulled interview. That's why I got muddled at the very top about going to the news. Here's the Prime Minister, Mr. Sunak.
Prime Minister, why have you chosen to come here? There was one patient who suggested you should be doing more on nurses' pay. Are you happy that they aren't getting a real term increase in their pay?
Well, it's brilliant to be here at Croydon Hospital to see the great work of the doctors and nurses here. One of the priorities for my government is going to be tackling the COVID backlogs and supporting the NHS. And what's going on here actually is a fantastic example of what's possible because of the way they're doing things here differently. Elective activity is now even higher than it was before COVID. And look, we face lots of challenges as a country, but I am confident that we can fix the economy and deliver on the promise of the 2019 manifesto, including having a stronger NHS. And while I'm here, it's important for me to say to anyone who's eligible, please remember to go and get your COVID and flu jab.
You talk about fixing things. How much of a mess did Liz Truss leave the nation's finances in? There's talk of a £50 billion black hole.
Well, I acknowledge that mistakes have been made, and part of why I'm now Prime Minister is my job is to fix them, and I'm confident that we can. The Chancellor's already said, of course, difficult decisions are going to have to be made, and I'm going to sit down and work through those with him. But what I want everyone to know is that we need to do these things so that we can get our borrowing and debt back on a sustainable path. That's important because it means that we can get a grip of inflation if we do that. It means we can limit as best as possible the increase in interest rates, which is important. But as we do that, I want people to be reassured we will always do it with fairness at the heart. We will protect the most vulnerable and ensure that we can continue to grow the economy in the long run.
Why do you think it's more important for you to stay here and supervise the work of the Chancellor rather than going to COP27?
Well, look, I'm really proud, as everyone should be, about our record on tackling climate change, and particularly with regard to COP. I think everyone will remember that last year we hosted one of the most significant COPs in recent time, and that was important because what we did there was set the targets and the roadmap for the world to follow if we're going to meet our climate ambitions. And I think actually everyone should also be really proud of how we're doing. We're one of the countries that has decarbonised the fastest. We now get over half our energy from zero carbon sources. We passed a landmark law to protect the environment, and under my government we're going to continue to deliver on all of those things.
Labour say it's a massive failure of leadership.
No, the leadership that we have shown on the climate is unmatched almost along the world. If you look at what we've done in this country, we're an example for others to follow at the pace in which we've reduced climate emissions, how we're going about protecting our environment, and those things are really important to me. It's important to me that as Prime Minister we leave behind an environment that is better for our children and grandchildren. I'm very passionate about that. I'm very personally committed to it, and I just think at the moment it's right that I'm also focusing on the pressing domestic challenges we have with the economy, and I think that's what people watching would reasonably expect me to be doing as well.
Did officials warn you not to reappoint Suella Braverman?
I think that the Home Secretary has acknowledged the mistake. She's recognised she made a mistake. She's taken accountability for that, and that's the right thing. Now, as I said in Parliament earlier this week, she raised this topic with me when I discussed reappointing her as Home Secretary, and I'm confident that she's learned from her mistake.
You don't have any regrets?
No, I said she's accepted her mistake and learned from it, and I'm confident of that. And what I do want people to know is, look, I and the Home Secretary are very focused on delivering for them, and that means we want to cut crime, we want to be tough on criminals, we want our streets to be safer for our families, and we want our borders to be defended, particularly against illegal migration. These are all really important priorities for the new government, and that's what I want the Home Secretary to be focused on, and that's what she's going to deliver.
Briefly, we've had 5 prime ministers in the last 6 years. In 2016, we voted to leave the European Union. Do you think that instability has anything to do with Brexit, or is it that there's a continuous civil war in the Tory party that is never going to be resolved?
I'm confident that our party is united. It's united behind delivering on the promise of the manifesto that we were elected on, with very strong support in 2019. What does that manifesto say? It says that we want to have a stronger NHS, that we want safer streets, that we want better schools, that we want to protect our borders, and that we want to level up the economy across our country. That's what unites and excites all Conservatives. That's what excites me, and that's what I want to deliver for the people of this country.
Thank you very much.
We call a pool interview in my trade. It happened just a little while ago, and again, I apologise for the less than elegant beginning to the programme, because we knew it was coming in. It's one interviewer, I think it was Libby Vina from ITM, but I'm not quite sure, to save the Prime Minister being bombarded by hundreds of camera crews, and then that is shared around the broadcasters, and we got it. So Rishi Sunak speaking there at the Croydon University Hospital, and the two standout words were mistakes and united. He said of Liz Truss, I've already admitted that, yes, mistakes were made. It is his job and his government's job to put them right. Make a diary entry for that autumn statement next month. We'll be talking about that a little later on with Philip Lond and also with Liam Halligan. And on the Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, the subject of much speculation and reportage at the moment. Yes, she did make mistakes, but she put her hand up and said, sorry, try better next time, and she's back in that job. Well, that one is not going to go away, and we will be watching that with great interest. And the second word is united. In the context of Brexit and all of that, Rishi Sunak said, my party, the Conservative Party, is now united. Watch this space. I'll be talking to Olivia Utley about how very clever the reshuffle was. Now it's complete from top to bottom in terms of warring factions, old enemies, new friends, and the rest of it. It really does tell us a lot more than just the big names who are the headline makers. So there we are. All of my colleagues will be mulling over that Sunak interview as the next 2 or 3 hours unfold, and I dare say we may well return to it. Now, one thing that he didn't comment upon, although it will be very much in his mind, is Northern Ireland, because Northern Ireland is now, of course, on course for Assembly elections after politicians there at Stormont missed the midnight deadline set by Westminster for restoring devolved government. Chris Heaton-Harris, who remains Northern Ireland Secretary, he was in the last government and he is in Mr Sunak's government, is now obliged to call elections to be held within 12 weeks. He's pledged to do that later on today, rather than try to delay it or avoid it with fresh legislation at Westminster. So we can cross over now to Belfast, where GBNews Northern Ireland reporter Dougie Beattie joins us. So it is written in stone, as it were, that elections are going to happen, and the only possibility was a little bit of shuffling and moving around the goalpost, but Heaton-Harris says no.
Well, he does say no, and he did say no 2 weeks ago at a press conference in Hillsborough Castle when he stood with Simon Coveney, the Irish Foreign Affairs Minister. He could have well went back and got more of that legislation extended when he was obviously going to have to go back to set a budget for Northern Ireland. That's due very shortly. That's about £9.6 billion per year, plus about 8.4 of Barnett consequentials. But he chose not to do that. Now, that hasn't went down well in unionist and loyalist working class areas areas this morning. They're very much seeing this as a weakness within the Westminster government, that they would rather call an election than deal with the protocol. That will only polarise politics here further. Sinn Féin will turn this into a border poll, and unionists who are afraid of that border poll coming out the wrong way will very much vote for parties like the DUP, and that may well squeeze the likes of the SDLP, more moderate National Party, who is already down in numbers drastically since the signing of the Good Friday Agreement, as is the Ulster Unionist Party on the other side of that divide. It is pretty much a blindness to each other's needs, and that has been the way from the Good Friday Agreement was signed nearly 25 years ago. Of course, it's the anniversary of that this year, and there may well be no Stormont up and running at that stage, because if these election results come back, it is expected that Chris Heaton-Harris, round about 2 o'clock in the building behind me, will announce that election for the 15th of December. It is, well, if they come back and it is as polarised as we think it will be, then we will still be back to square one, and the problems with the protocol will still be there, and still there will be no ministers in state. Elections with no governments is nothing new in Northern Ireland. The last one in 2017 saw Sinn Féin stay out for 1,044 days. This time it's the DUP that are refusing to enter. They are protesting over the European Brexit agreement called the Protocol. None of the unionist parties support it because it puts a border down the Irish Sea and annexes the commercial side of Northern Ireland. It's not just politicians that oppose it. Those in road haulage, such as Peter Somerton, say that the paperwork is worthless, and if implemented in full, the supply chains into Northern Ireland will stop within 48 hours.
I'll start with the value of the paperwork. The value of the paperwork is zero. And it's zero because these are all goods that are in free circulation throughout the rest of the UK. The cost of it, using the government's own numbers, for the Trader Support Service alone was 340 million. That's for 2.3 million declarations, £150 for each movement between GB and Northern Ireland Extra. Add to that, if they're SPS goods, the cost of health certification, which is about £150. The costs just become astronomical. That's why the government knows, and the EU knows, they cannot deploy the Northern Ireland Protocol. If the protocol was to be deployed as it's written at any point in time from the 1st of April 21, when it should have been, according to the law, then the supply chain for frozen and fresh goods into Northern Ireland would have, and I'll agree with one of my industry colleagues from last week, would last no more than 48 hours.
The cost of living crisis is already stretching budgets, and with less goods coming into Northern Ireland, costs are rising.
It's not hard to model this out. In fact, we can see it every day, because whenever we're moving goods from Britain to the Republic of Ireland, we can see an extension of the time delay in those goods that used to move day 1, delivery day 3, to now day 1 for delivery day 8. Now that just doesn't work whenever you bring it to the additional complexity of a fully integrated supply chain like exists between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. The government knows this, the Commission knows this. It's time that we're actually saying the emperor's no clothes, this doesn't work.
Belfast Port has always dealt with containers from right around the globe, but those from GB mainland are taken to one side, inspected by EU officials, and then told if they can enter the market and what tariffs must be put upon them.
There isn't anywhere else where third countries move the type of goods on the flows that move between Britain and Northern Ireland entering the EU. That just doesn't work like that. That's not how international trade works. It's a container load of beef with one cert moving across a deep water port, getting checked on a period of days into Rotterdam, into Calais, and then getting released into free circulation at the very start of the food process. What we have here is at the end of the process, instead we have got tens and tens and tens of commodities all in the same truck, all moving across the Irish Sea together. One fault on any one of these issues, and I have some examples in front of me. For example, I have an example here where on the same health cert, one product was rejected. So everything that was on the trailer actually went back to Britain. I have an example where the wrong shape of a letter I resulted in product being sent back.
A new election will not bring new results. The same two parties will be back in whatever order, and the more Liberal will be squeezed, and the problems with the protocol will still remain. Dougie Beattie, GB News.
Absolutely.
Well, you can see from that report that it's. Go ahead.
Sorry, I butted in there because you were about to say, as you can see from that report, I'm sure the problems are entrenched, and that lovely guy with all of his reams and reams of papers. I mean, we've kind of known that for so long, and the talks have been going on for so long. When are we going to hear from the Secretary of State in terms of the timetable, at least to make a final attempt to get out of this impasse?
Well, the one good thing that Liz Truss did do, actually, she had started with those hauliers, including that one. I was in Lisburn when she visited as Foreign Secretary. They had sort of designed this green and red system where goods coming into Northern Ireland would stay here and would not face the same checks. We've got to remember that this is taxpayers' money that he's talking about there. These haulage firms have not hidden that they're making a lot of money out of this, but £300 per pallet going into Northern Ireland, that is British taxpayers' money paying for that. And then businesses here then have about another £150 on top of that. Somebody has to pay for that. And in the times of cost of living crisis, we can only imagine that is coming to us in Northern Ireland. It has been added on to our groceries. It has been added on to all the goods that's coming to us. And so far, in retail, there is only 30% of the protocol that has been enforced. There's another 70% to come. This has to be sorted out, and I think the people of Northern Ireland needn't worry about green and orange issues. What they really need to worry about at this time is the money in their pocket. And at this time, it doesn't matter which of these political parties are saying what. They all need to get together and sort that out for the sake of the people of Northern Ireland.
Very well put, Dougie Beattie. Thank you very much indeed, as always. And if there is any movement on either side of the sea or either side of the border, you can bet your bottom dollar we'll be back for your views and judgment upon it all. But for the time being, Dougie Beattie, thank you very much indeed. Dougie Beattie there, our Northern Ireland correspondent, with the comings and, alas, not so much goings yet in Northern Ireland, as we've passed that deadline and await to hear from the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland what he is going to do next. Now, let's just broaden it out a little, because politics really has moved at quite a pace in recent days, perhaps with the notable exception of Northern Ireland. But now the new Prime Minister and his Chancellor have decided to take their time and deliver a full winter budget. They've decided to call it the Autumn Statement. The Prime Minister is also drawing up plans to expand the windfall tax on energy giants who caught the headlines as Shell reported those massive profits yesterday. Rishi Sunak and his Chancellor are attempting to raise billions simply to help try and balance the book. Well, we can now talk to former advisor to David Cameron, Philip Blond, a man who gives a great deal of thought to what the Conservatives are really all about. And Philip, what I wanted to ask you first of all is to tie together this decision by Rishi Sunak that he will not go to COP27 with the briefing that are coming out on the Autumn Statement and the need for tough and, as Jeremy Hunt put it, even embarrassing decisions have to be made. Is an image of Sunak Toryism beginning to emerge?
Yeah, I think so. And I think that what we're seeing for not going to COP27 is the focus on the domestic issue, also propagating the idea that we're in an emergency that requires an emergency response. And I think to be fair to the Prime Minister, he started very well. We get a sense of competence, a sense of serious engagement, and a sense of priority. And so I think he's playing the opening hands of this card game extremely well. And what we're going to see are, I think, a whole series of movements on tax and spend that they hope will both speak to the 2019 manifesto, put a bottom under the recent fall in the markets, which they've already done, but then put policy behind it so that the problems don't return. And that's what we're seeing, really.
Taxation thing, and I reminded folk at the beginning of our conversation that you work very, very closely with David Cameron way back when, and Dave and George Osborne were both very, very keen on big personal allowances because it sent out a vital signal, even to the poorest, that if you work and earn a little bit more with a big allowance, you will pay less tax. You can earn another 500 grand, whatever it might be, without paying a penny on income tax. The briefings at the moment are that it is quite likely that Jeremy Hunt and Rishi Sunak will continue the freeze in those allowances, so more people will drift into paying tax and more people also will drift into paying higher rates of tax. In my mind, that is a dreadful signal to be sending out by a new Tory Prime Minister.
Well, we've had fiscal drag, which I think is the term for the high tax allowances since Cameron and Osborne. Though they did raise the level at which you start paying taxes for the very poorest. It's really a political decision. That's why I think the debate around the windfall tax is interesting, because when Sunak introduced the windfall tax back in May, he had a tax break with it, which is you can discount the investment that you put into energy against and set that against any putative windfall tax. The impact of that, given the investment plans are already going on, is none of the big energy companies will pay any windfall tax this year, and then a small amount next year. So I think this burden needs to be shared. And under Truss, we had an extreme ideological point of view that any profit, no matter merited or unmerited, shouldn't be touched. And I really do hope we have a sensible and serious windfall tax, which is a tax on profits that you weren't planning for, that come from activities that aren't to do with yourself. They're an unexpected benefit. So we can distribute those profits to the whole community. And the chief executive BP, when asked which of your planned investments for the years to come will be cancelled if we have a windfall tax, said none of them. They're practically begging us to tax them and to lower the burden. And I just hope Sunak breaks with Truss's kind of ideology and then spreads that burden more fairly across all taxpayers, both business and private.
Yeah, and let me, just before I come to my final question, underlining that key point you made, is you can raise taxes, but you can let people off if they do the right thing, i.e. invest in other forms of energy and show that they're doing something good with those huge profits rather than simply chucking them at shareholders. My final question is this, and to me it's also crucial about defining Sunak Toryism and who he really is aiming at. The triple lock on pensions is clearly in play, and an awful lot of folk that I talk to say if they stand by it, that's securing the traditional blue rinse brigade who vote Tory, and it really is signalling to young voters, actually, do you know, we haven't got a great deal for you because we've got to make sure that our old voters are still with us. Tactically, strategically, very inept, Philip.
Yeah, and we've got a problem that for every pensioner living in poverty in this country, there's a pensioner who's a millionaire. There's roughly half of our pensioners are extremely well off indeed. And we haven't been able to help those who aren't well off, and we give the same amounts to both. And that's foolish. And particularly, and you put your finger on the point of generations, the level at which the majority start voting Conservative has now risen to 57. And it was in the 40s even 10 years ago. So what we are finding is a whole generation of people, not just young people, but people setting up families and having children, are being excluded from the goods of society. And conservatism has to deal with the issue of distribution. We have a distributional system that doesn't work, that is setting up barriers for capitalism to advance all, for distributing assets to all. And we're becoming a monopoly, oligopoly, plutocratic, there's 3 words for you, society. And that isn't a society that can prosper. And that settlement will essentially create an unbalanced society. And that's really what conservatism needs to tackle. And we can judge that on the budgetary statement on November the 17th, and we can have that discussion then.
Yeah, and funnily enough, that's what I think made the leadership contest between Sunak and Truss so interesting, because they both dared to get close to that fundamental debate. We probably do need to have it again, and no better person to start it with than you, Philip. Great to see you, and thank you for upping our vocabulary this Friday afternoon and finding time for us here on GB News. Always love it. Philip Bond there. A Tory thinker and former aide to Dave Cameron in the days when we had coalition governments and the Cameron government. More of that sort of stuff to come as we reflect upon where we are going as a country under this current Prime Minister, the latest in a series of Prime Ministers, but perhaps this one will be there for a little longer. Coming up, we'll also be going through the latest GB News People's Poll, which sheds intriguing light on that very issue, also on the government's prospects, with polling analyst David Cowling. But before that, let's bring you right up to date with the weather.
Every morning from 6 o'clock, we'll wake you up with GB News Breakfast with all the stories you didn't know from the night before.
So whether it's serious news, entertainment, or your own views from all over our great nation, we're here to kick off your day with a smile.
And the national media should be reflecting and reporting what's happening here. You will notice the northwestern accents.
Whether you're with us on TV, radio, or online, every morning, it's breakfast from 6 a.m. Hope you can join us.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Hello, I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m, where I'll be joined by 2 of the country's top comedians as we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight. If it's a big story, we'll be covering it, I guarantee, but we'll also have some fun along the way. That's GB News Headliners at 11 p.m. We won't put you to sleep, unlike some of the other paper review shows out there. So join us, 11 p.m, 7 nights a week.
Hello there, it's Eamon Holmes here from Breakfast on GB News. We're not just on your television and your screens, you know.
We're on DAB plus digital radio, so you can listen to your favourite shows on the move.
If you've not yet listened to GB News Radio, it's very simple. We're on your radio player and TuneIn apps, on your smart speaker, phone or tablet, or online at gbnews.uk.
Take us with you wherever you go. GB News Radio.
You never have to miss a moment of the People's Channel.
Just coming up to midday. Welcome back. You're watching GB Newsday with me, Alastair Stewart. And now, time for the People's Poll. Let's have a look at some of the headlines in this week's poll. It's a proper poll, proper sample. It's not just what you want to tweet in and tell us your views in one of those polls. This is the genuine article. And the view on Rishi Sunak remains divided, with 30% of people saying that they are favourable towards the new Prime Minister, but 40% saying that they are not. on whether Tory MPs have betrayed their members by appointing Sunak as Prime Minister. 27% of those asked said they agree, while 44% said the opposite. And finally, on whether they would vote in the next general election, how they would vote in the next general election, 58% in the poll said that they certainly would, and the detail of how they would vote is equally intriguing. David Cowling, our GB News polling analyst, is sitting right next to me. Intriguing in the sense that there is a little bit of movement that huge Labour lead that we've talked about every time that you've come in is still big, but it is beginning, even within days of Sunak becoming Prime Minister, it's beginning to slip.
It certainly is. There's a 6-point improvement over our People's poll of last week. For the Conservatives up to 20 and Labour down to 51. So those are still formidable obstacles.
Sure.
But these are early days. And as Philip Blond said in your previous segment, there appears to be signs of, he's a serious man. I would regard this poll as being, if you like, an early benchmark. He's inherited a position which has been one of the most tumultuous and disastrous in recent Conservative Party history. The idea that simply by being selected, he would go and everything would change is ridiculous. So we have to look at this, I think, in terms of, OK, this is where it starts. Is it retrievable on the basis of what we're finding in our poll? And there are some signs which hint that, he's got ground that he can recover.
Yeah. One of the other intriguing things, and you and I have talked about it on many occasions, because we don't have a presidential system, but all of the anecdotal evidence does suggest that when you go in there in South London to vote, and I go to vote in Hampshire, there is a strong element of thinking, right, do I want Starmer as Prime Minister or do I want Sunak as Prime Minister? And on that particular data set within this poll, there's much better news for Sunak over Starmer than there is for the Conservative Party over Labour.
Yes, I think we're finding that on the favourability side, we see that there's a 10% deficit, but it was a hell of a lot bigger under his predecessor. But there are challenges, Alistair. I mean, but they're not. It seems to me disastrous. I mean, in the general election voting, 58% of Conservative 2019 voters say they're Conservative now, and about 1/5 of them have gone to Labour. OK, so that's the challenge that he confronts. And when it comes to best to manage the economy, the Conservatives with Sunak, 19%, Labour with Starmer, 32%. But 50% say don't know or prefer not to say. So my point is not that on the surface of it, this looks magic for the Conservatives.
No, I completely agree with you. That's a big number that simply says everything to play for.
Yes.
Final point, the other standout bit of data for me is because all of the polls show, rightly or wrongly, that a headline issue of concern to ordinary folk out there, most of whom will vote come the election, is immigration. Neither party and neither leader is particularly favoured as someone who's going to roll up their sleeves and do something about boats coming across the Channel and sort out immigration.
You're absolutely right. Conservative government, Sunak is best managing the immigration, 18%, Labour, Starmer, 29%, but a whopping 53% saying don't know, prefer not to say. So once again, on this key issue for many people, we're watching. And we're waiting, and we'll make our decision at some stage in the future. So once again, not the best of figures for the Conservatives, but this is the benchmark start, and we'll be looking in subsequent weeks to see.
And the conversation I so look forward to that we will inevitably have mid to late November after the autumn statement will be the real one to go through with slide rules, microscopes and the rest of it.
Yes, we're already preparing.
David Cowling, so helpful, as always, to cast some light and put in context the numbers that come from the good people who are kind enough to take part in our People's Poll. Good of you to come in. Love to all at home and have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. David Cowling there, GB News, number cruncher and brilliant political analyst. Coming up, we're going through the new Prime Minister Rishi Sunak's first week in number 10. Was he right to bring Suella Braverman back into the Home Office? He said in that pool interview you saw right at the top of the programme, She made mistakes, she said sorry, she's being given another chance, which interestingly is exactly what Amber Rudd says in her brilliant interview, which is still to come as well, with Gloria De Piero. But first, lots more besides happening at home and abroad, so let's bring you right up to date with all of the news. Here's Alice Porter.
It's 12:35. I'm Alice Porter in the GB newsroom. Northern Ireland is on course for a pre-Christmas snap election as the deadline to restore the government at Stormont passed overnight. There's been no fully functioning devolved government since February. The Northern Ireland Secretary, Chris Heaton-Harris, will now call for an election to be held within 12 weeks. He's expected to lay out his plan later today. The DUP is blocking the restoration of power sharing in its protest against the Northern Ireland Protocol. A woman has been jailed for life with a minimum term of 34 years for killing her friend and decapitating the body. 38-year-old Gemma Mitchell has become the first woman to be sentenced on TV in England. The woman was found guilty of murdering Mi Kun Chong at her London home in June last year and then driving her body in a suitcase to Devon. The judge's sentencing was broadcast live from the Old Bailey in London. The Prime Minister has defended his decision not to attend the COP27 climate summit in Egypt next month. Rishi Sunak is facing widespread criticism from the opposition over his choice not to go, as well as from members of his own party. But speaking in South London this morning, he said he'll be instead focused on domestic issues here in the UK.
We're an example for others to follow at the pace in which we've reduced climate emissions, how we're going about protecting our environment, and those things are really important to me. It's important to me that as Prime Minister we leave behind an environment that is better for our children and grandchildren. I'm very passionate about that, I'm very personally committed to it, and I just think at the moment it's right that I'm also focusing on the depressing domestic challenges we have with the economy, and I think that's what people watching would reasonably expect me to be doing as well.
Meanwhile, Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer says not showing up to the climate conference shows a failure in leadership.
Prime Minister should be going to COP. He needs to show leadership. This is a hugely important issue, climate change. It's wound together with the energy crisis, and I think many people would be expecting the Prime Minister of the UK not just to attend COP, but to use it as an opportunity to pull world leaders together to deal with climate and to deal with energy. And if that doesn't happen, it's a failure of leadership.
TV, online and DAB+ radio, this is GB News.
Weekday afternoons on GB News, we've got the whole of the UK covered. From 12 to 3, it's GB Newsday with me, Mark Longhurst.
And me, Gloria De Piero. You'll get the very latest on everything that's been going on across our great nation.
And from 3 till 6, watch out for GB News Live with me, Patrick Christie's. I'm not here to mess around. With all the biggest topics and guests, you will always be up to date. GB Newsday and GB News Live from 12 p.m.
Only on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
Join me, Nana Akue, on Friday, Saturday and Sunday afternoons on GB News. Expect fiery debate and passionate discussion as me and my panel tackle some of the biggest topics hitting the headlines. It's a place for everyone's opinion. No one gets cancelled, but no one gets an easy ride.
Oh, she's on it today!
Be ready for conversations that are fierce, frank and, of course, fun. Every Friday, Saturday and Sunday afternoon from 4 p.m. on GB News.
On Mark Dolan tonight, we have a simple plan, which is to inform, stimulate and entertain in equal measure. It's all about getting your opinions on the national television airwaves. I love my viewer emails, mark@gbnews.uk. So do join me from 9 p.m. to midnight every Friday, Saturday and Sunday for big guests, big opinions and a big presenter. 6'5", don't you know? See you then on GB News.
It's 20 to 1. You're watching GB News. Welcome back to GB Newsday with me, Alastair Stewart. So the new Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak's had a busy first week. Of course, one of the very first things that he had to do was appoint his cabinet. Now, he's kept Jeremy Hunt as Chancellor of the Exchequer, and James Cleverly has stayed on as Foreign Secretary. Perhaps most significantly, however, was his decision to reappoint Suella Braverman as Home Secretary just days after she'd resigned over separate data breaches. He has faced pressure over this at PMQs and indeed from some of his own members of Parliament, but he continues to defend her decision. He told a pool interview just a little earlier this morning that, yes, she'd made mistakes, she'd fessed up to them, as it were, and she deserved a chance. You'll have more on that from Amber Rudd a little later with Gloria De Piero. So it is certainly notable, looking at that cabinet and all of the ministerial appointments across the scale, that Rishi Sunak is looking to unite his party by appointing his own backers, but many others who backed Truss and Johnson in the past. Remember, he also said significantly in that pool interview, our party is united. Well, if that's true, it's the first time for quite some little while. I'm delighted now to be joined by GB News political reporter Olivia Utley, and we had a chat about this first thing this morning, and we were toying, as it were, that reshuffles and forming governments, right from the very top right down to the lowest of the low, are things of art and things of science.
Absolutely.
How do you think he's done?
Well, I think on the face of it, he's done really, really well because there are so many different things that he had to balance. Of course, he kept talking about party unity, which is hugely important, but then he also had to balance age and youth, for example. He's got to balance the loyalists to him and the people he didn't want to bring only his loyalists over, because then he's got a problem of party unity again. And he's also got
which Liz Truss herself was very much seen to have done.
Exactly.
If you don't love me, you can't play.
Exactly. And perhaps the most significant thing, really, is he was very serious about getting real talent into the cabinet. And we haven't seen that for quite a long time. I think for the past two Prime Ministers at least, there's been a bit of a feeling around Westminster that there's a charmocracy going, and that some of the ministers there are there because they wouldn't really get promoted under anyone else. Whisper it. And so they've got an incentive to sort of keep quiet and toe the party line. Whereas Rishi Sunak's new cabinet is filled, as you say, from the very top to the very bottom, with people who have disagreed dramatically with Sunak, who've disagreed with lots of other prime ministers who've been serial rebels. And I was picking out a few of them. You mentioned there James Cleverly, who obviously said that he was wanted to back Boris Johnson. Ben Wallace, who also said he was leaning towards Boris Johnson. Braverman, of course. But then in the lower rungs of government, you've got someone like Steve Baker, who is a militant libertarian, who calls himself on the left on social issues, but a huge free marketeer. He was naturally...
Although buddies in the dim and distant past over Brexit.
Buddies in the dim and distant past over Brexit, very true. But, huge Truss supporter, and very, very different from someone like, for example, Jessie Norman, who Rishi Sunak has also promoted. Jessie Norman is known in the Conservative Party for being a huge brain and for not being one to toe the party line. He rose to prominence, for example, for abstaining on a very important vote on Syria. He's really not thought of as a kind of party man particularly. He's just a very clever person, written a book on Burke, knows exactly what he's talking about, knows where he's coming from, but not a kind of natural ministerial appointment necessarily. Couple of other ones, Robert Halfon, who is he's now back, he's in the Department of Education, but he's been leading the Select Committee on Education, and he's been a huge thorn in the previous government's side. He's been talking relentlessly, I used to commission him at the Telegraph actually, but he's been talking relentlessly about how children have been let down as a result of lockdown and that school had become an optional extra. He's been talking about those ghost children, those children who haven't got back into school.
Oh, and also, I mean, I've interviewed him many times at the weekend because I like you. I rate him as a brilliant chair of a select committee. But when Kevin Collins came out and said, if you really want kids in schools to catch up in the state sector in the same way that the private sector has done so well, you're going to have to spend about 15 billion. It was Rishi as Chancellor who said, no way, you can have 5 billion. And Halfon put a huge boot into him weekend after weekend after weekend.
Absolutely.
He's now Minister of State in the Department for Education.
Yes, and along similar lines, you've got Andrew Mitchell, who is well known for his stance on foreign aid. He's always wanting to up Britain's foreign aid budget. And he led a rebellion against Sunak as Chancellor when Sunak was threatening to put the level of foreign aid spending down temporarily over the COVID pandemic. So to bring someone like that in from the fold shows that Sunak is very, very committed, not just to party unity, but having a government of genuinely all the talents and from hearing from all sorts of different viewpoints.
In your experience, as a brilliant political correspondent, but also in terms of all of the folk that you talk to day in, day out, can a tent be too big for effective government?
Well, I think that is a question that is on everyone's lips at the moment. Right now, we're seeing, of course, massive party unity because the Conservatives have known that they've just been through the mill and that their ratings are at an all-time low. And I think that has really focused minds. The prospect of electoral oblivion is definitely something to make people pull their socks up a little bit. But it is sort of difficult to see. I mean, we saw with Liz Truss's government when suddenly we had Jeremy Hunt and Suella Braverman in the same cabinet. It only lasted a few days. Will it be possible to have the sort of Jesse Normans of the world along with the Steve Bakers of the world in the same cabinet? Are we just going to come up with clash upon clash upon clash? Someone like David Mitchell, who's all for foreign aid spending. How is that going to square with Jeremy Hunt's budget, which is going to be all about cuts? And we know that politically one of the easiest places to make cuts is on the foreign aid budget. I think that party unity is there at the moment, but it could fracture very soon indeed.
Really good political correspondents like you do not make on-the-record predictions because inevitably they tend to come stuck or unstuck, or at best you've got a 50-50 chance on it. But talking to people about Suella Braverman and looking at what the newspapers have been saying across the piece, I mean, there clearly remains a vulnerability. The Prime Minister chose to speak specifically about it in the Pool interview earlier on today. Is it your instinct that both he and she will survive this? Or is the Braverman saga not yet finished?
I would say my instinct, heavily caveated, is that they probably will survive it. I think that all the details have sort of come out now, and if she's still there now, it feels as though the wind is a little bit going out of Labour's sails. That said, I don't think, well, it's being said a lot in Parliament that Suella Braverman hasn't played this particularly well. What she did was... The specifics of what she did could have been considered a resigning offence, but she obfuscated a little bit after that and I think made out what she did was less bad than it was. So I think if we see her sort of put her foot in it again or try and play it down, then she leaves herself wide open to renewed attacks.
I mean, that's why I said right at the beginning of the conversation about it being an art as much as a science. I mean, there's also an awful lot of very serious people who say it had nothing to do with leaked emails and going to a wife of an MP who you just got a bit muddled over. It was all about being able to write that letter of resignation, putting the knife in to the back and front of Liz Truss.
And the idea that it was an argument all really about immigration, I think, holds true. I think the other thing is that Rishi Sunak and Suella Braverman's political futures are very much tied up together now. Because he didn't promote Kemi Badenoch, who was another sort of hero of the right of the Conservative Party, the right has massively united there behind Suella Braverman. And if he lost her, if he had to lose her, it feels he would lose a big chunk of the right of the party and a lot of party members whose main concern, let's not forget, is immigration.
Indeed. So I was just talking to David Cowling in our poll about it. That remains something that people out there remain deeply concerned about and don't see a saviour in either Rishi Sunak or Keir Starmer, intriguingly. Olivia, it's always a pleasure. Thank you very much indeed. I think we're talking again a bit later on as the day unfolds, particularly if we have any news from Northern Ireland about what's happening on that front. But for the time being, thank you very much indeed. Olivia Utley there, our political correspondent. Now, away from the world of politics, don't forget I did ask you to keep getting in touch with your thoughts and views on the world of politics or whatever else you may choose to do. You can do it by email or you can do it by Twitter. Which takes me neatly to our next story, because the world's richest man, Elon Musk, has completed his fractious takeover of Twitter and has ousted its top 3 executives. In an apparent nod to the £38 billion deal being finalised, Musk tweeted, The bird is freed. If you aren't on Twitter, there it is. You just would have seen if you're watching on television, if you're listening on radio. It is the blue bird of Twitter to which he is referring. There's also a brilliant picture of him yesterday, I think it was, carrying the kitchen sink, meaning if you've got that money, you buy the lot, quite literally. Billionaire has previously said that he wanted to buy the platform as he believed it was important to have a space where, and I quote, a wide range of beliefs can be debated in a healthy manner. So let's get some more on this from our reporter, Theo Chikomba. Theo, after much toing and froing, the deal was finally sealed, but you're at Twitter headquarters here in London. Heads have already rolled at a global level. It's not going to be peace in our time.
You're absolutely right. You said there it's been fractious over the last couple of months. This all started back in January when Elon Musk began to buy shares at Twitter, and by April he was a major stakeholder, and from there he started having meetings with those in the boardroom level. But here at Twitter HQ in the UK, I'm sure many people who work here will be thinking, what's going on next? Where is this company heading? Now, Elon Musk, he's he is the richest man in the world, estimated net worth around £241 billion, and his Twitter takeover, as you mentioned, £38 billion, around 44 billion US dollars. Now, in the past, he has criticised the social media platform, saying it's not allowing people to have their opportunity to say what they want. Those on the right of politics, conservatives have in the past criticised Twitter, saying it's not allowing them to, have their own opinions. And maybe could we see other people come back, people who maybe have been called divisive in the past, to come back on the platform? Donald Trump is a name that's been going around on social media this morning, and even Kanye West, who's been in the press recently. But going forward, who knows what this platform could look like? He could change absolutely everything on this platform. But again, it's been a long-running saga, and we saw in the early hours of this morning that tweet, the bird is freed, and his Twitter biography as well, changing to Chief Twit. So yes, it's been a long-running saga.
I love Chief Twit. I thought that was very, very good. Theo Chikomba there at Twitter headquarters in the UK. Thank you very much indeed for your insights, and keep in touch. Any more developments there, and we will be going back to Theo, because it's an intriguing story. It's an intriguing story because so many of us, stroke you, use it, but it's also an intriguing story in big money terms. So I'm delighted to be joined now by the co-founder of Regionally, that's Justin Urquhart-Stewart, currently there sitting in his red braces, as he always does. For those of us listening to our conversation, Justin, on radio rather than television, I'm just holding up the front page of the Financial Times, the pink 'un, the city's Bible, that says brutal week for big tech as investors knock $550 billion off market valuations of all of this social media stuff. Does that mean that Musk may well have ended up overpaying?
He's almost certainly overpaid for it. I mean, it wasn't actually certainly, he's really after it anyway. He started off really almost as a sort of flippant remark. And then he started finding himself in battle with the lead, with the Chief Twits there. And he was trying to get himself out of it. But he's almost then felt obliged to go through with it, and then get rid of the people who are criticising with it. And now he's going to make up various excuses as to why it's going to be so valuable. For anybody who actually uses platforms a lot, of a younger generation, they wouldn't use Twitter. It's for people of a age who are desperately trying to hang on to their hair still, who probably still use it. We think they're trying to be trendy with it. We're not. And so I wonder, he could afford it. It's absolutely irrelevant in terms of cost to him. And he'll be able to make some benefit out of it in terms of getting profile and being able to adjust what it's been doing into something which is hopefully going to try and make some money. But at that sort of price he's paid for it, particularly when all the tech companies are being so heavily hit at the moment, and it just shows actually how fragile part of this market is.
And it's interesting to note that whilst he's made a big hoo-ha about the issue of freedom of speech and whether Trump comes back onto Twitter or not, the first significant note that he wrote at length was to the advertising community, saying this is how Twitter will work as a money driver for you advertisers and for me as owner. Important decision.
Absolutely vital. If you look at the figures that we've seen coming out this week from Alphabet and Meta and all those areas, it's the advertising that's so crucial. And of course, we're going into a world now where it actually looks like advertising figures may be getting weaker And it just shows how open to sort of slowdowns like this these companies are. He has almost certainly overpaid for it, but I think overpaying, as far as he's concerned, is almost irrelevant. He can easily do it. It's going to be interesting to see how we can try and drive it away to a business which is not just dependent upon advertising, finding other things to do. Does he move into more like a sort of Amazon-style business, totally different altogether, but he can afford to throw money at it to try and change it? If it stays that it is, I'm afraid it's actually going to get a bit staler and staler as its audience declines. It's going to try and reinvent itself and make itself exciting to the next generation of people coming up saying, actually, Facebook's rather dull, and where else can I go? They wouldn't choose Twitter at the moment.
Absolutely intriguing. Both of the boxes ticked that I wanted ticked, Justin, as you always do. Thank you very much indeed. Justin Urquhart-Stewart there with his views both on Twitter as an investment vehicle. Jury out on that very clearly, as Justin said. But an intriguing debate still continuing, and it's an important one about freedom of speech and freedom of expression, and whether or not Twitter remains one of the better vehicles for that or not, we shall see. So my thanks to Justin, and more importantly, thanks to you for watching GB Newsday with me, Alastair Stewart. We've completed our first hour, and we've lots more to come over the next couple of hours. We'll be getting the latest on Northern Ireland, and we will also be heading to Twitter's London HQ again with Theo to see whether there's any more reaction from the people who work there, now under new ownership and indeed under new management. But before that, let's bring you right up to date with the weather.
Hello, Aidan McGivern here with the latest forecast from the Met Office. Rain will clear north through the rest of the day and it will stay breezy, especially in the north, but brighter skies are starting to emerge in many places. We've still got low pressure, a number of lows sitting to the west of the UK, and we've still got this very mild south to southwesterly airflow bringing a lot of cloud, and it has brought outbreaks of rain in from the south. Now, those outbreaks of rain stick around for some time across northern Scotland, especially Orkney, and then later on Shetland we'll see some persistent and at times heavy rain. Gales are an exposed coast of western Scotland and perhaps Northern Ireland. A few showers pushing in here as well, but elsewhere plenty of dry and increasingly bright weather, sunshine there for the southeast, and 20 or 21 Celsius possible. Mid to high teens elsewhere, so very mild for many. Temperatures well above average for the time of year. Clear spells continue then for many overnight, but further showers will affect central and western Scotland as well as Northern Ireland for a time. Outbreaks of rain move in by the end of the night across southern England and South Wales. And wherever you are, it's going to be a mild night, but not quite as mild across parts of northern and eastern England, Scotland and Northern Ireland. 4 to 7 Celsius here under any clear spells. A few mist and fog patches first thing. They'll disappear fairly quickly because it will get breezy and increasingly cloudy once again from the south. Now that breeze bringing gales into coasts of western England and West Wales, and outbreaks of rain arriving into southern Scotland, Northern Ireland by the afternoon. But brighter skies once again return in the south. 22 or 23 Celsius in the southeast where we get some sunshine, and once again high teens for many elsewhere. But it's an unsettled picture as we end Saturday across Scotland, northern England into parts of Northern Ireland. The rain clearing north, but further showers affecting parts of central and western England as well as Wales. Sunday looks like a showery day, especially towards the northwest, some heavy downpours in places. Monday and Tuesday, more wind and rain.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. You've been cancelled. Join the club. Oh my goodness me. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
We are GB News.
And we'd like to say thank you
To each and every one of you.
for helping our great nation
Find its voice.
We're absolutely everywhere.
across England, Scotland,
Wales and Northern Ireland. On TV.
On radio.
And online.
we're proud to be
The People's Channel.
Britain's
News channel.
On the Mark Steyn Show, we cover the stories a lot of people are scared even to mention. The stuff that really matters with some of the world's biggest thinkers.
Now is his opportunity to kind of take the steering wheel of history.
Break away from the flop at 8 o'clock on GB News with the Mark Steyn Show.
Every Saturday at 2 o'clock, join me, Darren Grimes, for Real Britain. I'm not afraid to give you a platform and say it how it is.
Come on, make the case. Something like this is very, very important to people.
And we're always up for a laugh on this show.
God, honestly, you'd think there were no problems in the world.
Real Britain, every Saturday on GB News.
Hello, I'm Michelle Dewberry, and you can join me every weekday 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr. Me and my panel will get stuck right into the day's events, and I can tell you, in fact, I can warn you, expect some robust debates, some strong opinions and perspectives from both sides of the fence. It's about you at home as well. I love to read out all of your comments, or at least as many as I can. So join me, Michelle Dewberry, Monday to Friday, 6 till 7 on Jubes and Kerr.
It is 1 minute past 1. Hello and welcome to GB Newsday with me, and hello, thanks for still being there if you've been with me since midday. Alistair Stewart. Coming up in this, our second hour, yet another elections looming in Northern Ireland after Stormont failed to reach an agreement on power sharing. It means an election will take place within the next 12 weeks. I'll be speaking to Lord Nigel Dodds on what the future of the protocol and how Rishi Sunak can help the people of Northern Ireland get through it all. Now, Rishi Sunak has also said no to attending COP27, but US climate envoy John Kerry has chucked a spanner in the works, saying that the King should attend the conference after former Prime Minister Liz Truss pleaded with him not to go. We'll get the very latest on that. And also, Gloria De Piero has sat down with the former Home Secretary Amber Rudd in a wide-ranging interview where they really got stuck into many of the big issues of the day, and also how she would get on top of the current crisis in the Channel. So do also remember to get in touch at gbviews at gbnews.uk. We really want to hear from you on what you think of the start of Rishi Sunak's premiership. Is he going to be a good Prime Minister? Is the jury still out? Let me know what you think. But before all of that, and indeed more, let's bring you the very latest news. Here's Alice.
Good afternoon. It's just gone 1 o'clock. I'm Alice Porter in the GB newsroom. Northern Ireland is on course for a pre-Christmas snap election as the deadline to restore the government at Stormont passed overnight. There's been no fully functioning devolved government since February. The Northern Ireland Secretary, Chris Heaton-Harris, will call for an election to be held within 12 weeks. He's expected to lay out his plan later today. The DUP is blocking the restoration of power sharing in its protest against the Northern Ireland Protocol. Peter Carl, the Shadow Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, says over the last 6 months there hasn't been enough focus on providing stability in Stormont.
Things have got quite dysfunctional because, unfortunately, in the 6 months that we have had since the last set of elections, we've had 3 Prime Ministers, 3 Secretaries of State for Northern Ireland and no negotiations or progress on the protocol. So all of the fundamentals that underpin peace, prosperity and progress in Northern Ireland just haven't been there. And also a crucial relationship that we don't talk enough about is the relationship between the Irish government and the UK government, which has reached an all-time low in recent months.
A woman has been jailed for life with a minimum term of 34 years for killing her friend and decapitating the body. 38-year-old Gemma Mitchell has become the first woman to be sentenced on TV in England. The woman was found guilty of murdering Mi Kun Chong at her London home in June last year and then driving her body in a suitcase to Devon. The judge's sentencing was broadcast live from the Old Bailey in London.
There is the chilling aspect of what you did to and with her body after you had killed her. You have shown absolutely no remorse, and it appears that you are in complete denial as to what you did, notwithstanding what, in my judgment, amounted to overwhelming evidence against you.
The Prime Minister has defended his decision not to attend the COP27 climate summit in Egypt next month. Rishi Sunak is facing widespread criticism from the opposition over his choice not to go, as well as from some members from his own party. But speaking in South London this morning, he said he'll instead be focused on what he called domestic challenges. He also said he'll be backing down on pledge to fine patients £10 if they miss GP and hospital appointments.
We're an example for others to follow at the pace in which we've reduced climate emissions, how we're going about protecting our environment, and those things are really important to me. It's important to me that as Prime Minister we leave behind an environment that is better for our children and grandchildren. I'm very passionate about that. I'm very personally committed to it, and I just think at the moment it's right that I'm also focusing on the depressing domestic challenges we have with the economy, and I think that's what people watching would reasonably expect me to be doing as well.
Meanwhile, Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer says not showing up to the climate conference shows a failure in leadership.
Prime Minister should be going to COP. He needs to show leadership. This is a hugely important issue, climate change. It's wound together with the energy crisis, and I think many people would be expecting the Prime Minister of the UK not just to attend COP, but to use it as an opportunity to pull world leaders together to deal with climate and to deal with energy. And if that doesn't happen, it's a failure of leadership.
Billionaire Elon Musk is now in charge of Twitter and has ousted its top 3 executives. Mr. Musk says he was acquiring the platform because he believed it was important to have a space where a wide range of beliefs can be debated in a healthy manner. The deal was valued at £38 billion. Ukraine's president has accused Russia of launching more than 30 drone attacks on the country in just 2 days. Volodymyr Zelensky says Moscow also carried out 4,500 missile strikes and over 8,000 air raids. Kyiv and 4 other regions may have further cuts to electricity supplies. It comes after a speech in Moscow yesterday by Russian President Vladimir Putin, who accused the West of inciting the war in Ukraine. But President Zelensky said Russian attacks on power plants would not break Ukrainian spirits.
Нас не зламають обстріли. Страшніше.
Shelling will not break us. To hear the enemy's anthem on our land is scarier than the enemy's rockets in our sky. We are not afraid of darkness. There will be more and more losses of the enemy. I am sure that hostile propaganda does not work. Provocations do not work. Threats do not scare. Any tough winter will not scare us.
І будь-яка важка
Emergency legislation protecting tenants from rent increases and evictions during the cost of living crisis has become law in Scotland. The Cost of Living Act is said to be the first Holyrood legislation to be given royal assent by the King. It will make sure ministers to temporarily freeze rent increases for private and social tenants and for student accommodation. It applies to in-tenancy rent increases with a cap set at 0% until at least March next year. This is GB News. We'll bring you more news as it happens. Now it's back to Alistair.
Alice, thanks very much indeed. We asked you for your views on what we were discussing today, and thanks very much indeed. On the Rishi Sunak interview that we began the whole programme with just after midday, Victor says Rishi Sunak hasn't been an MP for very long, but he knows all of the tricks. In today's interview, he didn't directly answer one single question. Well, I think he said on Truss mistakes were made and on Braverman mistakes were made, and he did say the party was united. But there we are. We'll be playing it again later on and reflecting upon it. On the triple lock for pensions, which we were discussing earlier on with Philip Bond, Trevor messages to say, here's an idea for the Chancellor when it comes to pensions. He says he wants to help the poorest pensioners, and many say rich pensioners don't need the triple lock rise. How about a 2-tier pension rise with the highest amount going to those on pension credit. Thanks for that, Trevor. Very thoughtful tweet. And on the current political state of affairs generally, Jamie says Tory voters are leaving in droves, but I can assure you in my working class area, they are not switching to Labour. People are apathetic about politicians, and there will be a record low turnout at the next general election whenever it comes, says Jamie. Intriguing, although David Cowling did say earlier on that quite a sizable chunk of those who voted Tory for the first time in 2019 are toying with Labour. So watch this place. Keep those tweets and emails coming in. Now, Northern Ireland is, of course, on course for an Assembly election after politicians at Stormont missed the deadline set by Westminster for restoring devolved government. The Northern Ireland Secretary, Chris Heaton-Harris, must now call elections to be held within 12 weeks. He's pledged to do that just as soon as possible, rather than try to delay it or avoid it with fresh legislation at Westminster. So we await to hear from the Secretary of State as to when that may well be. Delighted to be joined now live by Lord Dodds, who is the leader of the Democratic Unionist Party in the House of Lords. Welcome to you. In a nutshell, Dougie Beattie explained why the parties in Stormont couldn't agree on a speaker and couldn't agree on power sharing. But if the downside of that is fresh elections, isn't your party going to risk giving up yet more ground to Sinn Féin and to the Nationalists?
No, I mean, we don't seek this election, but we don't fear any election. And I think that the Democratic Unionist Party will actually do quite well because we have the support of unionists across the board. It's not just the DUP, by the way, that opposed the protocol in Northern Ireland. It's every single unionist elected to the Assembly. And unfortunately, a poll now will be divisive. It will be polarising. Not a single party in Northern Ireland seeks it. But the government seems intent on having it, and if it does go ahead, then we will fight it vigorously because we are determined that the protocol should be replaced because it undermines the Belfast Agreement, it undermines devolution, it drives a coach and horses through democracy in Northern Ireland, whereby laws are being imposed by the European Union without any say for anyone at Westminster or Stormont. So the government really needs to get on with dealing with the protocol. It has started the progress of the protocol bill in Parliament, and it has actually wasted a lot of time thus far. July last year, it told us that the conditions were right then for the triggering of Article 16, which would have suspended part of the operation of the protocol, but nothing has happened since. So, you know, we're ready for an election. We're confident that we will do well. But the real imperative is to replace the protocol because whatever the outcome of the election, the same problems will remain.
Crisply put, and I completely understand that. I have one slight problem with the analysis, and that is, I mean, the European Union, and it wouldn't it, obviously, claim that the protocol is working just fine. The government in Dublin says the protocol is working just fine. But here's the problem for you. When I've spoken to business leaders in Northern Ireland, which I often do at the weekend, not least the Federation of Small Businesses in Northern Ireland, very articulate men and women, they say, do you know, they can live with it. What they can't live without is some form of government that's sorting out the health service, sorting out energy crises and the rest of it. You owe them a form of government.
Yes, and we're keen to get into government, but the protocol is undermining the Belfast Agreement and the institutions of the agreement, which is unacceptable. Northern Ireland now works by the consent of both nationalists and unionists. There's not a single unionist elected to the Northern Ireland Assembly that supports the protocol. And you say that the protocol is working well, or the Irish say it's working well, and others. 80% of it isn't actually being implemented at the minute. If it were, business people in Northern Ireland have given evidence to the Northern Ireland Select Committee on the protocol that, in fact, supply chains to Northern Ireland would grind to a halt within 48 hours. So I dispute entirely this idea that business doesn't have any problems with the protocol. It does, and it's on record as saying that. And in fact, the government is spending billions, £500 million will do by the end of this year, on trader support schemes, movement assistance schemes, money being spent by taxpayers to prop up a system of paperwork being required to move goods from Great Britain into Northern Ireland through our own country, which is entirely unnecessary. Imposed costs on business imposed by the protocol. Never mind the democratic deficit, which means that people elected to this Northern Ireland Assembly do not have any say over large swathes of the law on the economy. So both from a constitutional and political point of view and an economic point of view and a business point of view, the protocol has to go. Now, the government has recognised that. It has set out in its command paper last year that it recognises the issues. The protocol bill that is brought forward recognises those fundamental issues. So we want government in Northern Ireland, but you can't have government in Northern Ireland operating under the Belfast Agreement when that agreement has had a coach and horses drawn through it by the protocol. That has to be dealt with. The government has known that for a long time, and unfortunately problems at Westminster, the chaos at Westminster, EU intransigence has led to the position that we now find ourselves in. But so be it. But I would say this to the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland and to those who are keen to have an election in Northern Ireland. The same problems will remain after we have this election. And if you're so keen on an election, why is it that you so much resist an election for the United Kingdom? They would actually make an argument for that.
You were always a brilliant sparring partner, and a nice one to pop in there. We also know, and you know better than I, but anybody watching this story knows very well, that Liz Truss, both as Foreign Secretary and briefly as Prime Minister, her fingerprints were all over what you've just described about the UK government's intention to play hardball over this issue. Do you get the same sense of confidence from Rishi Sunak?
Well, it remains to be seen. During the leadership campaign, he did say that he was committed to the protocol bill. There's been reports that during the most recent campaign for the leadership that he met senior Conservatives who are concerned about the protocol and gave them reassurances. But look, we have to wait and see. We have over the years learned to judge Conservative and other governments by their actions, not necessarily their promises. We remember a previous Prime Minister telling us that there would be no border down the Irish Sea and that any paperwork could be chucked in the bin. Of course, that turned out to be wrong. So we will wait and see. I wish any discussions well, but they do have to deliver the sort of outcomes that are in the protocol bill. Liz Truss made that clear. The government, in proposing the legislation in Parliament, made that clear. And we hope that that will be the outcome. And if so, then we can make progress, because on that basis, Northern Ireland can continue to trade openly as an integral part of the United Kingdom internal market. That's where the vast bulk of our trade is done with, not with the European Union, the rest of the world or anything else. It's mainly with the rest of Great Britain, and to put barriers and to remove our ability to make our own laws through the protocol is an absolute travesty, and that has to be dealt with.
Nigel Dodds, always a pleasure. Thank you very much indeed for finding time for us this Friday afternoon on GB News, and we shall be keeping in touch with you. Thank you, sir. Nigel Dodds, Lord Dodds there, who is the leader of the Democratic Unionist Party in the House of Lords here in the Westminster Parliament. Delighted now to be able to cross over live to Belfast, where GB News Northern Ireland reporter Dougie Beattie is. We talked to him at the very beginning. Intriguing conversation with Nigel Dodds. I put it to him the claims of the bureaucrats in Brussels and the leadership down in Dublin that the protocol was working just fine. And he said 80% of it isn't even implemented yet, and what has been implemented is not working just fine at all, which I think is reflected on the interviews that you had in your package that we discussed a little earlier on.
Well, it's not working just fine, and you're totally correct. That interview in that package was one of those men that actually did give evidence to the House of Lords. But I was in Dublin. I'm in Dublin all the time, but I did a few packages for GB News, and one of those was looking at what would happen if a trade war happened over the protocol. And Germany would suffer, Britain would suffer, but the biggest economy to suffer would be that of the Irish Republic. Its GDP is about 400 billion, 365 billion per year, and 65 billion of that comes from the UK. That is a big part of your economy, especially when you're only about 7 million population, which is the Republic of Ireland. So the big problem for all of this is that Sinn Féin in the polls in the Republic of Ireland, if there was an election tomorrow and those polls were to be believed, Sinn Féin would be the new Taoiseach and Taoiseach in the Republic of Ireland. They are the largest parliamentary party there at the moment, but they are also the largest party in Northern Ireland. And if that protocol, those protections to the economy of the Republic of Ireland aren't in place, well, they could face an absolute battering in the polls, for why would they be governing over some other economy that would hurt the Republic of Ireland's economy? So no matter what happens here, the protocol must be looked at, and the Republic of Ireland are trying to play down the problems that are with it. But there is problems to them as well, because when you export from the Republic of Ireland, you have a trade certificate, a Republic of Ireland trade certificate, that comes with the goods. But at this moment in time, those pieces of paper that Boris Johnson told us you don't need them, throw them in the bin for goods going from Northern Ireland to Great Britain, what's happening is an awful lot of Republic of Ireland goods are coming north, getting on the ferry and going straight into the UK. The EU want that stopped. They want that as 100% implementation of the protocol. That means that we will have to have goods from Northern Ireland with their source being examined, especially veterinary goods, and some of the food and so forth that's processed here may be meat from the Republic of Ireland. Yeah. So again, it's another layer of bureaucracy that will be put into place to stop goods going from Northern Ireland to its largest market, the UK. So there's lots to play for. Chris Heaton-Harris, the Secretary of State, has arrived here in Belfast, just walked in about 10 minutes ago behind me. So we do believe that statement is coming at about 2 o'clock. Whether we are let in or not, there is media all around me as we stand here outside Erskine House in Belfast. We will see if
you tell them I'm Doogie Beattie from GB News and I want in, and you get in there. The final point, it actually fits perfectly with that, and thanks for that heads up for 2 o'clock. But the other thing that Nigel said to me in that conversation, which I found genuinely intriguing, is he was obviously very warm to all of the noises that Liz Truss had made as Foreign Secretary and briefly as Prime Minister on this matter. And when I said, do you share the same confidence in Rishi Sunak, he said, well, that remains to be seen.
Well, let's face it, when the DUP party conference was on here many years ago, they brought Boris Johnson in, they clapped him on the stage, he said many things and then did exactly the opposite. I think most people in Northern Ireland, like most areas of the UK, have learnt to take an awful lot of what Prime Ministers and politicians say with the blowing of the wind, I suppose.
Doogie Beattie, thank you very much indeed. It is now, what is it? It's 22 minutes past 1, so 18 minutes to 2. Doogie Beattie there live in Belfast saying that the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, Chris Heaton-Harris, has arrived in Northern Ireland, and that Doogie is expecting an announcement at 2 o'clock. Which will almost certainly be that there will be elections in Northern Ireland to the Stormont Assembly before Christmas, because that's what the rule book says. And we couldn't be better served than by Doogie Beattie, who'll be there for us live, whether he gets into the conference or not. But I wouldn't like to put money against him getting in. He's the kind of guy who gets where he needs to be on your behalf, and we'll keep across that story as it develops. So it's now 23 minutes past 1, and coming up we'll be hearing from our economics and business guru Liam Halligan on that mini-budget autumn statement due up in November. All of that and more after this break.
Where would you like to go?
Just take me to the studio, please, Matt. You know where you're going. I've got a show to do. Friday Night Feast on GB News, 7 p.m. And it's like nothing you've ever seen before. We take a different angle on the week's biggest news stories. The viewers and listeners set me some absolutely mad challenges to do. We tried to rehome a rescue dog. And yes, there's some other wacky stuff in there as well. I feel like I could take on the world. Well, that's that. Friday Night Feast with me, Patrick Christie's, every Friday, 7 till 9 p.m. on GB News. Be there.
I'm Mark White. As GB News Home and Security Editor, I cover those key issues that are so important to you. Our authorities, our communities doing all they can to combat violent crime. With the public services under unbearable strain, why are we still failing to control our borders? Defence, the first priority of any government, has been continually hollowed out. Can we trust our politicians to protect the armed forces? Join me, Mark White, on GB News.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
Join me, Arlene Foster, for the briefing on GB News. Every Friday at 3 p.m, I'll give you all the latest political news and analysis, and we'll have robust live debate. To make sure that you're caught up on all of the biggest issues of the day, we'll bring on experts in their field. I'll ask the questions that you'd like to ask. We're not afraid to tackle discussions from all perspectives, including yours. Don't forget, the briefing with me, Arlene Foster, every Friday at 3 p.m. on GB News.
Hello, 26 minutes past 1. You are watching Newsday here on GB News with me, Alistair Stewart. Earlier this week, the Chancellor Jeremy Hunt announced that the government's plans for the economy, due to be outlined in a statement on the 31st of October, will now be delayed until the 17th of November and will be called a formal autumn statement, the language you used to have way back when you had a budget in the spring and you had an autumn statement in. Yes, the name is the giveaway, in the autumn. Mr. Hunt justified it by saying that the decision was based on the most accurate economic forecasts available. It's also now reported that Rishi Sunak and Chancellor Jeremy Hunt are considering up to £50 billion worth of spending cuts and tax rises as they confront a gaping financial black hole ahead of that budget. Well, I'm delighted to say, joining me now live in the studio is GB News economics and business editor Liam Halligan. First things first, the delay really was about trying to buy time and get some better economic news, not least on one of your specialist subjects, were you to do mastermind, interest rates.
Indeed. It seems that financial pressures on the government are still very tight, but they're easing. Two main reasons for that, Alistair. The first is that wholesale gas prices have been falling. They fell below €100 per megawatt hour this week, down from €350 per, so a huge drop in the summer. They're still double what they were sort of average over the last 10 years, but they're roughly where they were just before the war in Ukraine began in February. So a lower gas price means that it doesn't cost the government so much to deliver subsidised energy, that energy price cap. The other thing, government borrowing costs have come down from this time last week. They're about 4.2% a year on 10-year money for the government's borrowing, and that sort of ripples out across the economy, higher mortgage rates, higher personal loan rates. That 4.2, Alistair, now, I just looked before I came in for this conversation, it's just above 3.5. That is an enormous move, an enormous reduction in the interest rate paid on the debt by government of an advanced industrial economy like the UK. And that means that government debt interest payments are lower, it's 10, 20 billion pounds lower. So the combination of hopefully a lower bill for the energy price cap and lower debt interest means that fiscal black hole you talked about, it's still wide, but it's not quite the chasm it was.
And it is, that's why it's called a budget, although it's an autumn statement. It is literally going down. I've got to spend this on health, education, the rest of it, and I've also got to spend this amount on servicing the national debt.
If it's a budget,
if that squeezes, you've got a wee bit more for something else.
If it's a budget or an autumn statement, that means two things. It's you have OBR forecasts that it's based on. That's the Office of Budget Responsibility. The OBR is now, doing its best to model the economy, getting their ducks in a row in terms of their forecasting. And it means that you present both sides of the ledger. You present the tax side of the ledger, the revenue-raising side of the ledger of the national accounts, and you present the spending side of the ledger. Now, it may be that we don't see the full breakdown of departmental spending totals. It may be we just see the sort of envelope of overall government spending that will kick in from April next year.
Let's look importantly at the income side of that as well, because spending can be reduced and that helps balance the books, or you can increase income, raise taxes.
Yeah.
Philip Bond, at the beginning of the programme, when we went on air at midday, I had a fascinating conversation with him, and he was saying what Sunak and Hunt do on things like personal allowances, the amount you and I and everybody else can earn before we pay tax, or drift into higher rates, and secondly on things like the triple lock, has huge economic significance, but it also tells us a lot about the political philosophy of Rishi Sunak.
Indeed. Is he a small state conservative, given that the tax share of the overall GDP is at a 70-year high? And what the mini budget wanted to do was reduce it by like 0.5 percentage point. It was actually a light touch on the tiller, even though it caused such turbulence on financial markets and such political turmoil as well as we've seen. But I think on those two subjects, the triple lock, OK, will Sunak and his Chancellor Jeremy Hunt deliver that promise to raise the basic state pension from next April by either 2.5%, the average rate of earnings, which is about 5% increase, or the average rate of inflation, whichever is higher, 10.1%. If they do that for the 11.5 million pensioners, that's 16 billion quid right there, and we have to pay that forever because it's a permanent commitment. It may be, well, I don't reckon if they don't do the triple lock, I'm not sure that the government's own backbenchers will accept that. They may not vote through the budget.
We're back into manifesto territory.
Yeah, legislation, because they'd be going against the manifesto commitment. Remember how nuts a lot of Tory backbenchers went about Theresa May's dementia tax, right? And it's a similar thing. You don't mess with the grey vote. That's one of the sort of truisms of Tory politics.
If you're Rishi Sunak and you're, just as our People's Poll shows here on GB News, you're beginning the fight back, you're beginning to claw back some territory, but it's a hell of a long way to go. The last thing you do is shoot your core support, which I'm afraid is the Blue Ronce Brigade and pensioners.
That's right. So what I think will happen instead, and it brings me no pleasure to say this, and this is not inside knowledge, this is just the sort of surmise, piecing together fragments of conversations from lots of people in and around power. This is what we do, right?
Yes.
This is journalism. I reckon he will go for higher taxes in some areas, maybe even on a windfall tax. We had a windfall tax from the government in March, of course, though a lot of the increase, the oil companies could fend it off. In fact, they invested more money in North Sea oil and gas development. Oil companies, they already pay 65% tax on their profits. They pay 30% corporation tax, an extra 10% supplement, and then a 25% windfall tax on top of that. That may go even higher. We shall see. But if we do that, that will be a reversal of the Rishi Sunak we saw when he was last Chancellor, the former Chancellor, back in March. So let's wait and see. But it's going to be, I think, in general, the fact that they've managed to shift the fiscal statement back from October to November and the markets haven't freaked out. In fact, the markets have welcomed it.
Sure.
That's all about the government saying, we are now back in charge. We are now in control of the calendar and of events, and not for financial markets. Not, as we used to call them, Alistair, the gnomes of Zurich.
Indeed, indeed. We shall be all over it like a bespoke suit come November, because it will be crucial to everybody's spending power, tax bill and the rest of it, but also about the philosophy and direction of this government. Look forward to that very much indeed. For the time being, Liam Halligan, thank you very much indeed. Liam Halligan, there, our business and economics editor here at GB News. And it's just slipped past 1:30 after the break. We've an exclusive interview with the former Home Secretary, Amber Rudd. What does she make of Suella Braverman's return to that role? But first, let's bring you right up to date with all of the news. Here's Alice.
It's just gone 1:30. I'm Alice Porter in the GB newsroom. Northern Ireland is on course for a pre-Christmas snap election as the deadline to restore the government at Stormont passed overnight. There's been no fully functioning devolved government since February. The Northern Ireland Secretary, Chris Heaton-Harris, will now call for an election to be held within 12 weeks. He's expected to lay out his plan later today. The DUP is blocking the restoration of power sharing in its protest against the Northern Ireland Protocol. A woman has been jailed for life with a minimum term of 34 years for killing her friend and decapitating the body. 38-year-old Gemma Mitchell has become the first woman to be sentenced on TV in England. The woman was found guilty of murdering Mi Kun Chong at her London home in June last year and then driving her body in a suitcase to Devon. The judge's sentencing was broadcast live from the Old Bailey in London. The Prime Minister has defended his decision not to attend the COP27 climate summit in Egypt next month. Rishi Sunak is facing widespread criticism from his opposition over his choice not to go, as well as from some members of his own party. But speaking in South London this morning, he said he'll instead be focused on domestic issues here in the UK.
We're an example for others to follow at the pace in which we've reduced climate emissions, how we're going about protecting our environment, and those things are really important to me. It's important to me that as Prime Minister we leave behind an environment that is better for our children and grandchildren. I'm very passionate about that, I'm very personally committed to it, and I just think at the moment it's right that I'm also focusing on the depressing domestic challenges we have with the economy, and I think that's what people watching would reasonably expect me to be doing as well.
Meanwhile, Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer says not showing up to the climate conference shows a failure in leadership.
Prime Minister should be going to COP. He needs to show leadership. This is a hugely important issue, climate change. It's wound together with the energy crisis, and I think many people would be expecting the Prime Minister of the UK not just to attend COP, but to use it as an opportunity to pull world leaders together to deal with climate and to deal with energy. And if that doesn't happen, it's a failure of leadership.
TV, online and DAB plus radio, this is GB News.
My name's Tom Harwood and join me 9:30 a.m. every weekday for The Briefing, your one-stop shop for everything you need to know about what's going on in politics today. I wonder if this is a deal that might need to be like the biscuits in this factory, twice baked. Is there not an opportunity here to win out against the extremes?
Tom Harwood, GB News.
What are you going to do about it?
Things should have been done differently, and they certainly are being done differently.
Don't miss it. The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, 9:30 Monday to Friday on GB News.
Hello, I'm Alastair Stewart, and I'd invite you to join me at noon on Saturdays and Sundays for Alastair Stewart and Friends. I've been in this business for over 40 years. Now, here at GB News, I've never been happier. I get to choose the big stories that really interest me. We hear what you have to say, and you hear what I have to say. I really hope you can join me, noon on Saturdays and Sundays.
I'm Mark Dolan. Join me at 11 on GB News for Headliners, in which I'll be joined by two of the UK's top comedians discussing tomorrow's papers. If it's an important story, we'll cover it, but we'll have some fun along the way. Headliners, the late-night paper review that won't send you to sleep like the others will. 7 nights a week at 11 p.m. on GB News.
Weekday afternoons on GB News, we've got the whole of the UK covered. From 12 to 3, it's GB Newsday with me, Mark Longhurst.
And me, Gloria De Piero. You'll get the very latest on everything that's been going on across our great nation.
And from 3 till 6, watch out for GB News Live with me, Patrick Christie's. I'm not here to mess around. With all the biggest topics and guests, you will always be up to date. GB Newsday and GB News Live from 12 p.m.
Only on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. You're watching GB Newsday here on GB News TV and Radio. and online. And thank you very much indeed for so doing. It's me, Alastair Stewart, and I'm with you right up until 3 o'clock. We asked for your views and opinions on what we've been discussing and anything else on your mind. And if you were with us just a few moments ago for Alice's news bulletin, you will have heard Sir Keir Starmer at the end of that news bulletin bemoaning the fact that the Prime Minister had decided not to attend the COP27 climate conference. Well, Alan emails in saying, if Sunak had gone, then Labour would have criticised him for not focusing on the home issues. It is an impossible situation. On the current political state of affairs generally, Jamie has sent an email saying, Tory voters are leaving in droves, but I can assure you in my working class area, they are not switching to Labour. We've already had that one, actually, so thank you for that, Jamie, but I did read it out earlier on. And another issue, it was in the papers and we tweeted about it earlier on today. Apparently last month, over 1 million people did get a GP appointment and then didn't turn up. Shock horror, just crazy. And Alison tweets about that. Who are these idiots not turning up for a precious GP appointment? It is so thoughtless. Totally agree with you on that, Alison, particularly when so many people out there are desperate to see their GP and someone's got an appointment and then can't be bothered to turn up. If they've got a decent excuse, well, fair enough, I apologise. But if they haven't, it really is utterly ridiculous. And I do remember that the Prime Minister, when he was running in the leadership contest, talked about the possibility of introducing a charge if you do that. Well, that might be worth revisiting. Because what clearly people need is the ability to go to their GP. That goes without saying. But if you get an appointment, for God's sake, show up. It's ridiculous. Anyway, enough of that for now. Enough of me for now. This week, we, of course, saw Rishi Sunak crowned as the new Prime Minister. Pressure's mounting on him over the reappointment of Suella Braverman as Home Secretary. Now, Gloria De Piero sat down with another former Home Secretary, Amber Rudd. And she has branded the Rwanda deportation policy as brutal, but she says that Suella Braverman deserves a chance in the post. They also had time to reminisce about her famous quote that Boris is not the man that you would want to drive you home at the end of the night. And they also discussed just what a tough job it is to be Home Secretary. So with my good friend Gloria De Piero and indeed my good friend Amber Rudd, this is Life and Times.
Amber Rudd, so pleased to see you.
Great to see you too, Gloria.
Because your party has been through one heck of a couple of months. What have you made of it, having been such a big figure in your party until 2019, just watching on telly like the rest of us?
It's been like watching a horror movie, really. I find myself absolutely gripped. So sometimes I think I'm over it, I'm beyond politics, I've moved on to other things, but I've just got to check on Twitter what the latest drama is. So I've been watching through my fingers the dramas, the ups, the downs of the past 3 or 4 months. It's been very upsetting, and I am, I think, relieved, happy that we now have what I hope will be a more stable government.
I remember during the referendum debates, and you were a leading Remainer. The government, the David Cameron government's position was to remain, of course. Boris Johnson, Michael Gove, others took a different view. And I always remember seeing you and listening to you saying to Boris Johnson, you were colleagues at the time, you wouldn't want Boris Johnson. He's not the man you want driving you home at the end of the evening.
Yes, I think that might have been my finest moment in politics. I still have people coming up to him because, Gloria, you haven't given the whole line. The whole line is Boris Johnson is the life and soul of the party, but not the man you want to drive you home at the end of the evening. And there was a sort of sharp intake of breath when I said this. I realised as I said it, a few people were going to call it a little bit inappropriate, but it really landed. Plenty of people agreed with me.
What did you mean by that?
I'd like to think I meant something much more innocent that was interpreted, but it was interpreted with such vigour, I just decided to nod and sit back from it. But it was an incredible debate, and when I was asked to do it, it was by far the biggest thing I'd done. it was a huge responsibility. And in politics, I always think, and I say this to young men and women who ask me advice about getting on in politics, you have to get noticed. You have to be bold, and you have to take risks with your own ability, your own status. And so when I was asked to do the debate, to represent Remain, I accepted it, thinking at the same time, oh, how am I going to do this? How am I going to pull this off? And they took us for all sorts of training. We had Alistair Campbell advising me how to attack the Conservatives opposite me, which was a worrying proposition. Nicola Sturgeon, who was on our team, didn't come to the preparation. She sent a stand-in, which should have really been a sign that I'm not sure she was wholly committed to the cause. But overall, we thought we did rather well. But the Leave campaign, of course, did better, and they just kept on repeating their lines again and again and again. And I could see that Boris, who had two women either side of him, had been told not to interrupt, to let other people speak, and despite himself, he managed to do that. So even though I thought we put up a good case, they did too.
Was he cross with you afterwards? Did he joke with you about it? Did he say, Amber, that was below the belt?
He wasn't cross with me, but you know what it's like when you're doing live television. You might have, if you're lucky, a minute in a break to get a comfort break. And we had 90 seconds for a comfort break. And we all ran out and had to run back again, obviously, in time. And he just shouted at me as we went, ready to surrender, Amber? As though somehow he'd won and we'd lost. But I said, absolutely not, ready to fight on. He never got offended at anything I said, and all thought it was part of the cut and thrust.
You must have sat with Liz Truss in Cabinet. You obviously sat with Liz Truss in Cabinet. Were you friends?
Yeah, we were friends. She came to my 50th birthday. I went to her 40th. Her 40th lasted later into the night than my 50th. We were friends, and we got on pretty well, really. In fact, I was looking at my old file of cabinet photos the other day. First cabinet I was in 2015, she was in as well. We're both sort of somewhere at the back row in the power play of junior cabinet roles. And then now, well, at least not now, but a week ago, when Liz Truss was at the centre of her own cabinet as Prime Minister, I reflected that she was the only person from the cabinet 7 years ago that was in the current cabinet up till last week. I mean, politicians' lives are short.
You were Home Secretary, one of the great officers of state. We were in the same intake. I sat on the opposition benches for all that time.
Yes.
Watched your meteoric rise. The migrant crisis, the small boats crisis, I don't remember that being a thing.
No, I mean, there were plenty of immigration issues that really were important when I was in the Home Office and difficult to deal with. But the so-called small boats crisis was not. I think in 2018 we had, in fact, I checked this because of the recent figures, we had 300 approximately come across in the whole year. And now it seems to be that per day. It's extraordinary the way it's changed.
Why? Because we keep hearing successive Conservative Home Secretaries saying they will deal with this, they will sort it out. Is it possible to sort it out?
It's very difficult to sort it out. And the fact is there are always going to be, I think, a lot of people who want to come through France and into the UK because UK is a great country, a lot of their family are here, they speak the language. There are compelling reasons to come to the UK, but it is a dangerous crossing. And as people keep on doing it and succeeding, the smugglers and the people traffickers keep on saying, look, this is working, let's do more of it. I think part of the reason that it's happened on this scale is because it's become more difficult to travel by lorry because actually the detection on the lorries has been so good. And then, of course, they didn't come during COVID. And generally, the view was that the channel was too dangerous for people to come across in small boats. And that held until people started doing it and realised they could. But the only answer, I think, and this is what I would advise anybody who's trying to actually address it, is to have a good relationship with the French. And if you have a
We keep giving them lots of money.
We do give them lots of money, and you have to, because we're trying to patrol borders, which are effectively shared borders between them and us in northern France. And it's right that we do try and do that. It's pretty irritating for the French, because they've got a lot of people camped there, and they are willing to help these people, put them into homes, give them, support, but they don't want it. They just want to be there, waiting for the opportunity to get across to the UK. But the only way we can stop that is by having a better relationship with the French to patrol control it, but also to have a better story about it. Because also in my last year, we were returning some people to Europe, to France, when they arrived, because we could say that under the Dublin arrangements, we could legitimately return people to another European country if they'd come there first. Now there's none of that. People who get here, no, they're not going to be returned to another European country. So the government has proposed this idea instead of sending people to Rwanda. I don't believe in it. For the start, I think it is a brutal policy, which we should not have introduced anyway, but it is also, putting that aside, impractical. I just don't believe it will ever happen. So I think there's a real problem with the growing numbers of people putting their lives in danger. In a way, it's a shared problem with the French, and I hope that this new government is going to address it by having a better relationship with the French. I mean, let's face it, it can only improve.
Rishi Sunak says he's committed to the Rwanda policy. Obviously, he's brought Suella Braverman, who I might ask you about a question about in a second, as Home Secretary, who is fervently, she dreams of sending people to Rwanda.
Yeah, I mean, that's an extraordinary thing to say. She should dream of having a safer policy, which certainly she's entitled to dream about having borders where you don't have lots of people arriving across a dangerous passage like the Channel, but not perhaps to put it quite in those terms that she has. I think it's difficult politically for the Conservative Party to step back from a policy they've proposed and have said is the answer, but I question whether people think it can really have any impact or is actually going to take place. The only way to try to improve on the situation is to have a better relationship with the French and with the EU. The whole issue of immigration and refugees is not a situation just for the UK. It has to be taken as part of an international policy, but particularly with the EU.
Were you surprised to see Suella Braverman, who resigned a matter of days ago over a breach of the ministerial code, brought back days later?
I was surprised, but to be fair, she hasn't really had much chance to be Home Secretary. It's an incredibly difficult job. I think there are very few politicians who wake up in the morning and think, you know what I really want to do? I want to be Home Secretary. It's not a job that people usually really want to do because it is incredibly hard. When I say hard, it's not just difficult to get right, like we've been discussing on immigration. You're also dealing with some of the worst of humanity, the things you have to try and see and help people with. And when you discuss issues like child sex abuse or violent crime, these are things that are disturbing and difficult, and your job as Home Secretary is to try to help form policy and support the people dealing with it. So let's give her a chance and see how it goes.
So you were Home Secretary. You had to resign when you were Home Secretary. What is the emotional and psychological impact of resigning from a great office of state?
I think I always find that question quite difficult because I don't want to draw attention to any difficulty I felt, because I resigned over something which I think was a great sin, really, committed against a large number of people by the country, by the state. And the fact that it was difficult for me and my family is as nothing, really, compared to the terrible difficulties and wrongs that were committed to people of the Windrush generation, who are the people who were really badly treated by a whole series of Home Secretaries and Prime Ministers who quite simply were unable to regularise what should have been perfectly simple situation, which is people who arrived at a certain period of time, largely from Caribbean countries, should have been given their papers so they were accepted as British citizens. And over quite a long period, it emerged that they hadn't been, and they were treated appallingly. So, but to answer your question, of course it was upsetting for me, but I was genuinely more, I think I'm trying to be honest about this here because I got nothing to lose on it. I think I was generally more appalled and upset on behalf of the people, some of whom I saw and talked to, who had their lives so terribly disrupted by this horrific behaviour from the state.
It's Very noble of you.
Yeah,
no, it is. I mean, genuinely,
yeah.
It's sincerely held.
I think if I was still a politician, one could cynically say that's too noble. That sounds ridiculous. But since I'm no longer a politician, and I do reflect on it, it does shock me that these terrible things were done to so many people.
You have a daughter, very outspoken, very clever, Flora. Would you ever recommend to your daughter or somebody you loved, a woman, to go into politics?
I try to. I really do, because like you, I hope, Gloria, we know the value of it and the potential for doing good and real things. But I go around quite a lot of schools and colleges still as part of the fun I have, really, about being an ex-politician. And a lot of the women look at me and they think I'm absolutely mad. They might have made the mistake of looking at my Twitter feeds and they go, how can you bear it? But then you have to tell them that there is such value in what you do, and I give them sort of examples of the good things that I think you can do, whether you're Conservative, whether you're Labour, even if you're Lib Dem. But my daughter has absolutely no intention of doing that. She's going to fight different battles, and good luck to her.
Did the abuse bother you? Did you get any abuse?
Yes. I got a lot of, even before I became Home Secretary, as I remember saying to one of your former colleagues, Chris Bryant, there's a lot of personal attacks on MPs and some people have had death threats. And he said to me, I don't know a single MP who hasn't had death threats. I mean, everybody has them. And in our time in politics, and just a little bit after, 2 MPs were killed. So there is reason why people are nervous of the life of an MP, but I still think it's a really valuable thing to do.
I think you're missed in public life.
Oh, that's very generous of you.
It's really nice to chat about your
you.
life and times and your recollections of that time in office. Thank you, Amber Rudd.
Thank you, Gloria.
I agree. Absolutely intriguing stuff, and 2 women for whom I personally have the highest possible regard, and that series of interviews that Gloria has done, and it is with Tory MPs. Remember, Gloria used to be a Labour MP herself, as Amber just said, but also a range of Labour MPs, Liberal Democrats. They're some of the standout bits of journalism that we produce. Enough time to get tough questions answered intelligently and for you to reflect upon it all and make your own minds up. So do look up all of the ones that Gloria has done. But that was Gloria with Amber Rudd there. Sitting next to me in the studio, I'm delighted to say, again, is Olivia Utley, GB News political reporter, listening to that as well. And I'm not being light-hearted about it, but to me, one of the standout moments was when Amber said, no senior politician wakes up of a morning saying, oh, I want to be Home Secretary today. Because, as I said to you, I can remember way back when John Reid said, this is still a department not fit for purpose. Tony Blair reformed it, created the Justice Department and the rest of it. It's still not fit for purpose.
No, absolutely. And we're reminded then of why Amber Rudd resigned, and it was the pressure started with the Windrush scandal, but it was all because she hadn't seen or had misinterpreted some documents which I hadn't quite reached her. Basically, it was a whole string of just mistakes, and it felt as though that whole awful Windrush scandal, where people's lives were seriously, terribly impacted, was all just because of incompetencies down the line. And it's such a big department. Henry Hill was talking earlier about perhaps splitting the department up, which has aired quite a lot as an idea. And there seems to be quite a lot of merit to it, because the department responsible for immigration, the police, a whole host of other domestic issues just seems to be too big for anyone to get a grip of.
It's also interesting to remind ourselves of, there have been so many Home Secretaries recently, and Grant Shapps was there briefly, but Priti Patel was there for a long time, wrestling with that immigration story that Amber said remains an absolute headliner, and in her view, Suella deserves a chance to try and cut a deal with the French, although she doesn't think Rwanda will work. I mean, Priti got into difficulties, but did highlight that there are real problems, that an elected politician created Home Secretary or any of the great offices of state, you've got to work with the senior staff that you're given. And maybe sometimes that's where the problems lie, just as much as with the top politicians.
Yes, definitely. I think we know really over many, many years there have been so many clashes very high up between Tory Home Secretaries in particular and the sort of machinery of the civil service, which sometimes it seems reacts against policies or doesn't work particularly hard to force through policies that it doesn't agree with. And it's often suggested that the Home Office in particular there are some civil servants, senior civil servants there who may be biased to the left, which can make things quite difficult for Tory politicians.
Well, that'll be interesting for Suella Braverman, for sure. Olivia, as always, thank you very much indeed. Great to see you, and see you again later on, I hope, very much indeed. Olivia Utley there, GB News political reporter. Now, it is just inching up towards 2 o'clock, and you are indeed watching GB Newsday with me, Alastair Stewart, and we've lots more to come in the final hour, so please don't go away. But before that, we are all going to take a quick break.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Hello, I'm Esther McVeigh.
And I'm Philip Davis.
Whether you're watching or listening on TV, online or on radio, we handpick the latest stories, debates and expert opinions for your weekend. So whether that's politics, news or showbiz, we've got it covered.
Join us every Saturday morning at 10 o'clock on GB News.
We are GB News.
And we'd like to say thank you
to each and every one of you
for helping our great nation
find its voice.
We're absolutely everywhere.
Across England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland.
On TV,
on radio
and online.
We're proud to be
the People's Channel,
Britain's news channel.
On the Mark Steyn Show, we cover the stories a lot of people are scared even to mention. The stuff that really matters with some of the world's biggest thinkers.
Now is his opportunity to kind of take the steering wheel of history.
Break away from the flop at 8 o'clock on GB News with the Mark Steyn Show.
On Mark Dolan Tonight, we have a simple plan, which is to inform, stimulate and entertain in equal measure. It's all about getting your opinions on the national television airwaves. I love my viewer emails, mark@gbnews.uk. So do join me from 9 p.m. to midnight every Friday, Saturday and Sunday for big guests, big opinions and a big presenter. 6'5", don't you know? See you then on GB News.
Hello, it's 1.5 minutes past 2. Welcome to GB Newsday with me, Alastair Stewart, into our third and final hour. If you've been with us since midday, thank you very much indeed. Coming up this hour, it remains all to play for at Stormont. We believe that in the next hour, and possibly quite soon within that hour, we will be hearing from the Northern Ireland Secretary of State, Chris Heaton-Harris. Another election certainly looms because of the failure to reach a power-sharing agreement within that magnificent building of Stormont. We will bring you the very latest as it unfolds. Also, the production of the first coins for the King will be going into circulation very shortly. There they are being produced at the Royal Mint, and the circulation begins the transition, I guess, in terms of brand from the late Queen Elizabeth II to her son, Charles III. His portrait, of course, will be on the nation's coinage going forward. And we'll be speaking to GB News royal reporter Cameron Walker about that and the other bits and pieces of the royal brand. Plus, is this one of the greatest albums ever? Indeed, is it possibly the greatest album that the Beatles ever produced? It is called Revolver, and it has been remastered and re-released. The album is widely regarded as being a game changer for popular music, and we'll be discussing the legacy of that album, and particularly one track on it, which is one of my all-time favourites, Taxman. Why does it still retain such relevance to today? But before all of that, let's bring you right up to date with the other news on this busy Friday. Here's Alice Porter.
Good afternoon. It's 3 minutes past 2. I'm Alice Porter in the GB newsroom. A snap election in Northern Ireland is looming after the deadline to restore the government at Stormont passed overnight. There's been no fully functioning devolved government since February. The Northern Ireland Secretary, Chris Heaton-Harris, will call for an election to be held within 12 weeks. He's expected to lay out his plans later today. The DUP is blocking the restoration of power sharing in its protest against the Northern Ireland Protocol. Peter Kyle, the Shadow Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, says over the last 6 months there hasn't been enough focus on providing stability in Stormont.
Things have got quite dysfunctional because, unfortunately, in the 6 months that we have had since the last set of elections, we've had 3 Prime Ministers, 3 Secretaries of State for Northern Ireland and no negotiations or progress on the protocol. So all of the fundamentals that underpin peace, prosperity and progress in Northern Ireland just haven't been there. And also a crucial relationship that we don't talk enough about is the relationship between the Irish government and the UK government, which has reached an all-time low in recent months.
A woman has been jailed for life with a minimum term of 34 years for killing her friend and decapitating the body. 38-year-old Gemma Mitchell has become the first woman to be sentenced on TV in England. The woman was found guilty of murdering Mi Kun Chong at her London home in June last year, then driving her body in a suitcase to Devon. The judge's sentencing was broadcast live from the Old Bailey in London.
There is the chilling aspect of what you did to and with her body after you had killed her. You have shown absolutely no remorse, and it appears that you are in complete denial as to what you did, notwithstanding what, in my judgment, amounted to overwhelming evidence against you.
The Prime Minister has defended his decision not to attend the COP27 climate summit in Egypt next month. Rishi Sunak is facing widespread criticism from the opposition over his choice not to go, as well as from some members of his own party. But speaking in South London this morning, he said he'll instead be focusing on what he called domestic challenges. He's also backing down on a pledge to fine patients £10 if they miss GP and hospital appointments.
We're an example for others to follow at the pace in which we've reduced climate emissions, how we're going about protecting our environment, and those things are really important to me. It's important to me that as Prime Minister we leave behind an environment that is better for our children and grandchildren. I'm very passionate about that. I'm very personally committed to it, and I just think at the moment it's right that I'm also focusing on the depressing domestic challenges we have with the economy, and I think that's what people watching would reasonably expect me to be doing as well.
Meanwhile, Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer says not showing up to the climate conference shows a failure in leadership.
Prime Minister should be going to COP. He needs to show leadership. This is a hugely important issue, climate change. It's wound together with the energy crisis, and I think many people would be expecting the Prime Minister of the UK not just to attend COP, but to use it as an opportunity to pull world leaders together to deal with climate and to deal with energy. And if that doesn't happen, it's a failure of leadership.
Ukraine's president has accused Russia of launching more than 30 drone attacks on the country in just 2 days. Volodymyr Zelensky says Moscow also carried out 4,500 missile strikes and over 8,000 air raids. Kyiv and 4 other regions may have further cuts to their electricity supplies. It comes after a speech in Moscow yesterday by Russian President Vladimir Putin, who accused the West of inciting the war in Ukraine. But President Zelensky said Russian attacks on power plants would not break Ukrainian spirits.
Shelling will not break us. To hear the enemy's anthem on our land is scarier than the enemy's rockets in our sky. We are not afraid of darkness. There will be more and more losses of the enemy. I am sure that hostile propaganda does not work. Provocations do not work. Threats do not scare. Any tough winter will not scare us.
Emergency legislation protecting tenants from rent increases and evictions during the cost of living crisis has become law in Scotland. The Cost of Living Act is said to be the first Holyrood legislation to be given royal assent by the King. Ministers can temporarily freeze rent increases for private and social tenants and for student accommodation. It applies to in-tenancy rent increases with a cap set at 0% until at least March next year. This is GB News. We'll bring you more news as it happens. Now it's back to Alistair.
Alice, thanks very much indeed. 8 minutes past 2, we were tipped off that the Secretary of State in Northern Ireland, Chris Heaton-Harris, would give a statement around about 2 o'clock. It ain't happened yet, but I can assure you that the moment it does, we will be all over it with Dougie Beattie, because Northern Ireland is now on course for Assembly elections after politicians there missed that deadline last night, midnight, by Westminster for restoring devolved government. As I say, Chris Heaton-Harris, the Northern Ireland Secretary, has no choice but to call elections to be held within 12 weeks. And he's pledged to do that today rather than to try to delay it or avoid it with fresh legislation at Westminster. And I'm delighted to be joined. There are few better people to be sitting next to me than former First Minister of Northern Ireland and, of course, fellow GB News presenter Dame Arlene Foster. Been there, done it in these occasions. Just remind folk at home why Chris doesn't actually have much choices in terms of eventually coming before the camera to say there will be elections on the 12th of December or whenever.
Yeah, because that's what the legislation says. After 6 months since the last Assembly election, if an executive hasn't been formed, then the Secretary of State is under a duty to call another election, unless he takes powers not to call an election. Of course, Parliament is supreme, as you know, Alistair, and they could decide under a new Prime Minister not to call an election. But it's more than likely that he's going to announce that there will be an election. And I thought it was very interesting today, Alistair, Bertie Ahern, who you will know, used to be the Taoiseach, the Irish Prime Minister back in the day, made a comment today which I thought was very telling coming from that source. He said, an election won't change a damn thing. No. And that's the point. It's going to be a very costly election. It's going to alienate people even more in Northern Ireland, I would argue. And yet it's coming in the days of Christmas.
I put it to Nigel Dodds earlier on the programme that it might just change in one way. I mean, I completely accept what Bertie has said there about the protocol and the legislation that sits on the stocks in Westminster and what have you. But one thing that might change is that the DUP could be hurt by these elections of having to go into polling again, because the movement of travel north and south of that border is for Sinn Féin at the moment, becoming the biggest party hand over fist.
Well, I think most people are saying, yes, Sinn Féin are going to do well out of this election again, but the DUP will also do well because the middle ground will be the place that will be sacrificed. So the SDLP and the Ulster Unionist Party, those parties who used to be the largest parties, nationalists and unionists in Northern Ireland back in the day when I first started in politics, they will be the ones that will suffer as a result of this election, because people will go to either side, if you like, and so the DUP may well pick up votes. And don't forget as well...
because the Alliance did quite well last time, funnily enough.
They did, but the TUV, which viewers and listeners may not be familiar with here on the mainland, actually gained 60,000 votes in the last election, and they're to the right of the Democratic Unionist Party, and I would think that quite a few of those votes will probably go to the DUP in this election. So it'll be an interesting election from that perspective. There won't be that much movement, I don't think, in the number of seats, maybe one or two here or there, Alistair, but I don't think... I do agree with Bertie Ahern, and people watching will say, Arlene Foster's agreeing with Bertie Ahern. Yes, I am. It'll not change anything.
Intriguing. The other thing that Nigel said, and I wrote it down immediately, he said it because I thought it was very interesting, he was talking about that there is legislation in Westminster about Article 16 and about tearing up the protocol and walking away from it and what have you. And he gave a very strong health report on Liz Truss and her approach and attitude towards these matters, both as Foreign Secretary and briefly as Prime Minister. On Rishi Sunak, he said, that remains to be seen?
Well, it does remain to be seen, because during the leadership election, which we felt was going on for quite some time in the summer, Liz Truss was very clear in relation to what she would do around the protocol. She went so far as to say that she needed to deal with the European Court of Justice's remit in Northern Ireland as well. Rishi Sunak was not as clear, and therefore I think that makes a lot of unions quite nervous in relation to what's going on between himself and the European Union. The protocol bill is in the Lords at this present moment in time. It'll come back to the Commons. It'll probably ping-pong a little bit between the two, because there are a lot of peers who are against the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill. If the government are going to use that as a negotiating tool and say to the European Union, we have to have a negotiation here, because let's be honest, Alistair, the European Union have not changed their mandate.
No.
They haven't changed their mandate. So when people talk about, let's have I listened to Peter Kyle, the Shadow Secretary of State, this morning saying that there hadn't been negotiation. You can't really negotiate if people haven't changed their mandate and they're sticking by what they said right at the very beginning.
But I think Bertie was referring to it in that statement you began our conversation with, and you've alluded to it, that there isn't anything to change, that the Republic of Ireland is a part of the European Union, the single market and all the rest of it. Northern Ireland is part of the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom voted for Brexit. Therefore, never the twain shall meet. Therefore, the significance of that point from Nigel about it remains to be seen with Rishi Sunak is it going to be a case of see you in the international courts?
Well, the reality is, of course, we didn't have to be here in relation to the protocol. There were other ways to deal with goods coming from Great Britain into Northern Ireland and then on.
But, Arlene, we are where we are.
We are where we are, but we could always go back to that position, and that is the realistic position, to allow trade to go through that needs to go into the Republic of Ireland. It is checked, but goods that are coming into Northern Ireland solely for the use of people in Northern Ireland should not be checked. And therefore there is a fundamental problem there, and it goes to the sovereignty of the issue as well. It's not just about goods moving about, it's about identity and it's about sovereignty. And
but if that's the case, then why doesn't Chris go down that road rather than go through the agony of the poor folk in Northern Ireland having to trudge through the rain and the sludge and the rest of it, to have elections that, as you yourself have just said, probably ain't going to change a great deal. It might be a few seats here and there, but the balance between the two top jobs will remain the same?
Well, I don't know. I have fought elections in the wintertime. It's not a very pleasant prospect, I have to say. The nights are long, the days are short, the wind and the rain and the snow and everything else is not conducive to calling with people and asking them for their vote. So elections in the wintertime are to be avoided at all costs. Never mind the cost. We're told it's £6.5 million to run a Northern Ireland-wide election. So, obviously, it'll be up to him. If he decides not to call an election, it'll be a big story, I have to say. It looks as if he is going to call an election. But we'll wait to hear from him very soon.
We're running 16 minutes late, so that's quite a delay. Something may be happening. Arlene, stay where you are, if you'd be so kind, because the minute it does happen, I want your wisdom and context as well. But while we're waiting for Chris Heaton-Harris, the Secretary of State, I'm delighted to be joined by another good friend of mine and of GB News. There he is, author and journalist Eamon Malley, who has been covering all of these events for longer than most of us care to remember. Arlene Foster obviously comes from a particular point of view on these matters, but our conversation began with her quoting Bertie Ahern, the Taoiseach, and I was talking to Nigel Dodds earlier on. Do you believe that this is a tipping point, or that it's just another chapter of fudge and smudge?
It's just, I think it's inertia, more inertia potentially. That's how I would see it, political inertia. We're going nowhere in a hurry. I wonder, and it's simply a question, whether if the Democratic Unionist Party emerged a stronger party in this particular election, in other words, if they then were in a position to hold the post of First Minister, the question is, would that change their attitude or their view towards reformation or re-establishment, the restoration of an assembly in Northern Ireland? Currently, Michelle O'Neill is First Minister-elect in accordance with the previous election. In the eventuality of this election, would the Democratic Unionist Party emerge as the stronger party, the biggest party, affording them the right to hold the post of First Minister? Would that make a difference in their attitude towards the restoration of the Assembly? Now, Jeffrey Donaldson keeps saying no, unless the protocol is altered accordingly, they will not go back into Stormont. It's debatable, though, I think.
Yeah, intriguing. Arlene Foster was listening to that, and I'm trying to read her face, but I think that's a great big no.
No, because the First Minister and the Deputy First Minister have exactly the same powers, as Eamon knows. So, I mean, the whole point of this is leverage to get the government to deal with the Northern Ireland Protocol. It's not about who's First Minister and who's Deputy First Minister.
Yeah, OK. Damon, second point I wanted to try, Eamon, come back. Yeah, go on.
Yeah. I know the difference between the role of First Minister and the second and the Deputy First Minister. They're co-equal in legalistically, they're co-equal, but symbolically, and that's where the difference takes place. Symbolically, whether Sinn Féin or a unionist who is known as the First Minister in common parlance, that is symbolically important.
Yeah, all right. We're going to park that one there for the time being, because I want to put something different to you. And you and I have talked about this on many occasions as well, the role of Downing Street and Westminster in this whole process. Nigel Dodds said on this programme about an hour ago that she had great confidence in the efforts that have been made by Liz Truss, both as Foreign Secretary and briefly as Prime Minister, to do the right thing by the people of Northern Ireland. He said, as far as Rishi Sunak's concerned, well, that all remains to be seen.
Yes, and I think this is the problem for unionism. Can they trust any British Prime Minister? Reality, no. Arlie knows that. They've gone down this road hundreds of times with British Prime Ministers, right back even to Margaret Thatcher, behind the backs of unionism. Margaret Thatcher was entreating with Republicans. That's the history. Patrick Mayhew picked up the cudgels, and he entreated with Republicans. Peter Brooke did the same. Secretary of State after Secretary of State, Prime Minister after Prime Minister, including John Major. They were up to their oxters in secret negotiations with the Republicans. And that's, I must say, I can understand the anger and the angst of unionism, because they are clinging to British Prime Ministers who habitually go behind their backs and cheat on them. That's the reality of life.
Isn't the reality of life as well, Eamon, something that Arlene conceded in the first part of my conversation with her, and that is the reality of Brexit for the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland as part of the United Kingdom is such that it is in many respects intractable unless somebody goes absolutely to the wall, whether it's a breach of an international law, whether it's a tearing up of a treaty. Such is the nature of this challenge for any Prime Minister, any Secretary of State, that it really is in the intractable, too difficult to solve box.
No, we will get a solution to this. We were in more difficult circumstances running up to the Good Friday Agreement. And the Good Friday Agreement happened because the two Prime Ministers, the Prime Minister of the Irish Republic and the British Prime Minister of the day, Tony Blair, they put their shoulders to the wheel, and it happened. This problem is capable of resolution. But I think there's an imbalance in the argument being promoted throughout the United Kingdom by unionism. The reality is the farming community in Northern Ireland are doing very well out of the protocol. Manufacturing is doing extremely well. So there's this notion that the country here is falling apart because of this protocol. Not true at all. There are many, many positives being enjoyed by a lot of people in business in Northern Ireland. I accept that at the heart of the unionist concern is that what nationalists originally saw as the imbalance from their perspective in Northern Ireland as Catholics, as nationalists, they called it then a lack of parity of esteem. Essentially, unionism believes that a border down the Irish Sea is undermining their parity of esteem with the rest of the United Kingdom. They believe that because of that border, they are being treated differently to any other part of the United Kingdom. And there is potentially a bona fide attaching to that particular argument. But it's wrong to think that Northern Ireland, that the economy is crumbling here because of the protocol. Not true. Farmers, I heard a farmer of unionist extraction who, I can only conclude, he milks almost 400,000 cows day and night and morning. And he said, if it should come to pass that the protocol is set aside, we're in real trouble, he said, as dairy farmers, because my milk is picked up by a company which brings it across the border, is processed there. And he said the reality is we haven't got the steel here. We haven't got the capacity to process that milk. And he said the dairy farmers will die.
Forgive me, we have to leave it there with you waxing eloquent about the farming community in Northern Ireland, a crucial part of it, and the fact that life does continue and that shoulders to the wheel may yet resolve these matters. Always a pleasure to talk to you. Eamon Malley, thank you very much indeed, and to hear Arlene Foster commenting upon that as well. We did have to interrupt that because we have to meet various points for our breaks and the rest of it, and after that I'll be going through the latest GB News People's Poll with GB News political reporter Olivia Utley. And if you're one of those on Twitter saying, where is it, it is there on social media, and I've asked the GB News team on social media to repost it so you can see all of the detail of it and perhaps make more sense of my conversation with Olivia about it. But it's got some intriguing headlines, and we'll have all of that after this short break.
Hello there, it's Eamon Holmes here from Breakfast on GB News. We're not just on your television and your screens, you know.
We're on DAB plus digital radio, so you can listen to your favourite shows on the move.
If you've not yet listened to GB News Radio, it's very simple. We're on your radio player and TuneIn apps, on your smart speaker, phone or tablet, or online at gbnews.uk.
Take us with you wherever you go. GB News Radio.
You never have to miss a moment of the People's Channel.
Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
Join me, Arlene Foster, for the briefing on GB News. Every Friday at 3 p.m, I'll give you all the latest political news and analysis, and we'll have robust live debate. To make sure that you're caught up on all of the biggest issues of the day, we'll bring on experts in their field. I'll ask the questions that you'd like to ask. We're not afraid to tackle discussions from all perspectives, including yours. Don't forget, the briefing with me, Arlene Foster, every Friday at 3 p.m. on GB News.
Hello, I'm Alastair Stewart, and I'd invite you to join me at noon on Saturdays and Sundays for Alastair Stewart and Friends. I've been in this business for over 40 years. Now, here at GB News, I've never been happier. I get to choose the big stories that really interest me. We hear what you have to say, and you hear what I have to say. I really hope you can join me, noon on Saturdays and Sundays. Hello. We are moving swiftly but surely towards 2:30, and you're watching GB Newsday with me, Alastair Stewart, and I'm with you right up until 3 o'clock when Arlene Foster will be back. We're hoping that twixt now and then we may have an announcement from Belfast on those elections, but if not, you can't be in safer hands than Arlene come 3 o'clock, but we'll be keeping a weather eye out on it, and I promise you faithfully you won't miss a thing. We were talking earlier on with David Cowling about the People's Poll. This is a proper poll that we do with proper pollsters, with a proper sample, not just do you think X or Y, and then vote accordingly to Twitter. This is the genuine article, so this is the People's Poll. And this week, the view on Rishi Sunak remains divided, with 30% of our people saying that they are favourably disposed towards the new Prime Minister and 40% saying that they are not. On whether Conservative MPs have betrayed their members by appointing Mr Sunak as Prime Minister, 27% of those asked said that they agreed with that assertion, while 44% said the opposite. And finally, on whether they would vote in the next general election at all for anyone or any of the above, 58% in the poll said that they certainly would be voting. And joining me live now in the studio, I'm delighted to say, is GB News political reporter Olivia Utley. As I was saying earlier on to David Cowling, Labour is still ahead as the party, although the gap is beginning to shrink just a wee bit, as it is, to be fair, in other polls that have been conducted. But in terms of Starmer versus Sunak, the news is almost exclusively pro-Sunak.
It is, and I think that's definitely a worry for Labour. There was an interesting leak of new Labour attack lines that Keir Starmer and the party has given out to Labour MPs to argue why we should have a Labour government. And one of the things which they're concerned about is that under both Boris Johnson and Liz Truss, Keir Starmer could be distinguished as the sort of safe pair of hands, the grown-up in the room. Boris Johnson had the reputation of being a bit of a rogue. Liz Truss, obviously, after the mini-budget, was thought to be doing things far too quickly. Whereas with Rishi Sunak, he's a former banker, he's a sort of teetotal in terms of his personality, and then he's also a fiscal conservative. He's considered, he's a former chancellor. He is considered
fiscal being
much
tax policy, spending stuff.
Yes,
yeah.
And he's considered a safe pair of hands. So Keir Starmer is unable to distinguish himself as the new safe pair of hands, which makes it much harder for him. They're both sort of looked at by the public as the men in grey suits, which makes things quite tricky for Labour. As for Sunak, it's a mixed bag. I mean, as you say, the news is all good in terms of Sunak versus Starmer, but Rishi Sunak must be thinking wistfully of his poll ratings in 2020 and 2021, when he was the Chancellor who delivered furlough and made those very powerful speeches about being prepared to use the full might of the state to help people out in their time of need. Obviously, then he was the Chancellor who was giving out money, which is quite easy to do, and now he's the Prime Minister who'll be taking away people's money.
And crucially, Philip Blond, who big thinker in Tory party circles, worked with Dave Cameron for a long time, he was saying that delayed autumn statement, late November, would be a defining moment, because he'd have to take decisions on taxation as well as spending, on things like indexation of the pension and other benefits and what have you, that will define him, like it or not, in that one brief statement that will come from Jeremy Hunt.
Yes, definitely. And I think that we're talking at the moment, it was supposed to be on Monday, this Monday, the fiscal statement, and it's been moved back. But the fact that it's been moved back does mean that they'll have a lot of figures available to them, and whatever he says will be set the rest of his premiership sort of in stone. And at the moment, we can see pretty much every Tory MP and a lot of party members and voters in general, according to our excellent People's poll, are ready to sort of give Sunak a chance, ready to get behind him. But lots of people are keeping their powder dry. They're not yet coming out with a definitive statement on what they make of the Sunak premiership. It's not surprising. We don't quite yet know what Sunak Toryism is going to look like, but that statement will give us a much clearer idea.
Final quick one, and I risk being told off by the lovely people driving me along in my ear. But a standout point from the People's poll for me was that most of the sample don't trust either of them on immigration.
No, don't trust either of them on immigration. And in fact, only 58% are saying that they certainly would vote in the next election, which I think is quite damning, actually, of Keir Starmer, when you consider...
Did immigration feature in those attack lines that you said have been issued by the Labour Party to MPs?
No, they didn't, which I think is quite interesting in itself. The Labour Party...
Don't want to talk about that.
Yeah, they don't have a good, solid line on immigration. They know that the public wants to reduce net migration and obviously stop the small boat problem.
Both sides need to realise, from everything you and I read and listen to from our lovely listeners and viewers, they better get their act together soon. There's a hunger for it out there. Olivia, always a pleasure. Thank you very much indeed. Good to see you. Olivia Utley there, GB News political correspondent on the People's poll. And if it hasn't now appeared on social media in full, I can assure you when I come off air at 3 o'clock, I shall be screaming and shouting on your behalf, but I hope by now it is up there. After the break, I'll be talking to cultural historian and friend of mine, Philip Kisley, about the influential album Revolver, following its re-release 56 years on, and how the Beatles' music played a key role in the protest movement back in the 1960s. But in the case of Revolver, it wasn't Vietnam and love and apples and hair and flowers in San Francisco. It was about fiscal policy, as Olivia and I were just discussing. All of that after the news with Alice.
It's just gone 2:30. I'm Alice Porter in the GB newsroom. A snap election in Northern Ireland is looming after the deadline to restore the government at Stormont passed overnight. There's been no fully functioning devolved government since February. The Northern Ireland Secretary, Chris Heaton-Harris, will call for an election to be held within 12 weeks. He's expected to lay out his plan shortly. The DUP is blocking the restoration of power sharing in its protest against the Northern Ireland Protocol. Peter Carr, the Shadow Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, says over the last 6 months there hasn't been enough focus on providing stability in Stormont. A man has been convicted in Bristol of murdering his former partner, who died 21 years after he doused her with petrol and set her on fire. Stephen Craig targeted Jacqueline Kirk in a car park in Weston-super-Mare in 1998. She suffered burns to 35% of her body. In 2000, Craig was convicted of grievous bodily harm with intent, as well as attacking another woman. He was arrested again in June last year, following Miss Kirk's death. During the trial, medical experts told the jury how Craig's actions 21 years ago had made more than a minimal contribution to her death. The Prime Minister has defended his decision not to attend the COP27 climate summit in Egypt next month. Rishi Sunak is facing widespread criticism from the opposition over his choice not to go, as well as from some members of his own party. But speaking in South London this morning, he said he'll instead be focused on domestic issues here in the UK.
We're an example for others to follow at the pace in which we've reduced climate emissions, how we're going about protecting our environment, and those things are really important to me. It's important to me that as Prime Minister we leave behind an environment that is better for our children and grandchildren. I'm very passionate about that. I'm very personally committed to it, and I just think at the moment it's right that I'm also focusing on the depressing domestic challenges we have with the economy, and I think that's what people watching would reasonably expect me to be doing as well.
The husband of the US House Speaker, Nancy Pelosi, has been violently assaulted after a break-in at the couple's California home earlier today. The statement says the assailant is in custody and the motivation for the attack is under investigation. Paul Pelosi was taken to hospital where he's receiving medical care and is expected to make a full recovery. His wife was not in San Francisco at the time. TV, online and DAB+ radio, this is GB News.
Every morning from 6 o'clock, we'll wake you up with GB News Breakfast with all the stories you didn't know from the night before.
So whether it's serious news, entertainment, or your own news from all over our great nation, we're here to kick off your day with a smile.
And the national media should be reflecting and reporting what's happening here.
You will notice the northwestern accents.
Whether you're with us on TV, radio, or online, every morning, it's breakfast from 6 a.m. Hope you can join us.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Hello, I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m, where I'll be joined by two of the country's top comedians as we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight. If it's a big story, we'll be covering it, I guarantee, but we'll also have some fun along the way. That's GB News Headliners at 11 p.m. We won't put you to sleep, unlike some of the other paper review shows out there. So join us, 11 p.m, 7 nights a week.
Hello there, it's Eamon Holmes here from Breakfast on GB News. We're not just on your television and your screens, you know.
We're on DAB plus digital radio, so you can listen to your favourite shows on the move.
If you've not yet listened to GB News Radio, it's very simple. We're on your radio player and TuneIn apps, on your smart speaker, phone or tablet, or online at gbnews.uk.
Take us with you wherever you go. GB News Radio.
You never have to miss a moment of the People's Channel.
Welcome back. It's 22 minutes to 2 and you're watching Newsday here on GB News TV and radio with me, Alastair Stewart. We have spent the last couple of hours talking about fiscal policy, monetary policy, Northern Ireland protocols and all of the rest of it. But we're going to spend part of our remaining 20 minutes or so talking about a subject very close to my heart as well, and it is popular music, and it's significant. This is an album that sparked off the conversation, so familiar to pretty well anyone with even a passing interest in popular music that you wouldn't think that there could be anything new to hear about it, but there is. The Beatles album Revolver has made a comeback 56 years after its first pressing because it has been re-released, remastered, and that is because it is one of the most significant albums that great group ever produced. It includes top hits as variable as Yellow Submarine right across to Taxman, which is a classic and so brutal that it threatens to leap out and strangle the nearest representative of Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs. But how influential, in your view, was it as an album in the 60s? Well, the critic in the Times newspaper this morning, in the Times section 2, says it actually was the most significant. Forget Sgt. Pepper, the Double White album, and all the rest of it. Revolver is the standout one. So to discuss that and more, I'm delighted to be joined now by a good friend of mine, cultural historian, Dr. Philip Kinsella, and there he is. So first and foremost, how influential, in your view, was this album, Revolver?
Well, first of all, it's lovely to speak to you again, Alistair. It can't be overstated. I think what Revolver does, it's one of those albums, it bifurcates the 60s. So first of all, you've got the swinging 60s and you've got hedonism and you've got the post-war generation who are making the time their own. Then after Revolver, you've got the counterculture and everything that's in Sgt. Pepper that we'd celebrate so much in Sgt. Pepper and that we should celebrate so much in Sgt. Pepper because it's so musically and culturally important is there in embryo in Revolver.
How absolutely intriguing. And I said in my introduction, because it was the only point I disagreed with Mr. Hodgson about in the Times, where he said, describes Taxman as a sort of easygoing, gentle bit of protest music. I fundamentally disagree. That period of protest music, whether it was Bob Dylan or others, was about Vietnam War, it was about love and peace and hippies and flowers in your hair and what have you. This is George Harrison at his most acerbic, about 1 for you and 19 for them. Declare the pennies on your eyes. The taxman's coming for you. It was magic stuff, well ahead of its time.
Well, I think you've got to remember as well that the amount of tax they were paying 95% super tax. And the implications of that further on into the late 60s and into the 70s, of course, everybody earning that kind of money left the country because they couldn't afford to work. But it had a massive effect on things like the British film industry, for example. But if we just go back to the song, yes, the song's searing. It opens the album in an amazing way. And it's a pushback against the Wilson government, but it's also actually on a deeper level. It's a protest against what the were spending the money on at that time. And they were spending the money, a lot of that money was going towards weapons. And of course, George Harrison, being a pacifist as he was at the time, was absolutely vehemently against that. So I think the song works on two levels there. It's a libertarian push back against taxation, but it's also a countercultural push against what was going on. And we see later on in the 60s much more.
Also, Philip, you would have spotted as well, it was brilliantly non-partisan, because there's one chorus where it's Taxman Mr. Wilson, Taxman Mr. Heath, both the leader of the Labour Party then and also the Tory Party. We've got about 30 seconds left, and of course that tax scenario did drive the greatest rock and roll band in the world, the Rolling Stones, to the south of France, but that yielded exile on Main Street, so what's to complain? Final 10 seconds for you. I think you've answered it already, but Revolver, ahead of the White Album, ahead of Sgt. Pepper?
Yes, I think so. I think it was the album that started all of that. As I said, all of that stuff is there in embryo in Revolver, and it's just a fantastic album.
All right, great to talk to you. Next time up, we'll be discussing the relative merits of Let It Bleed and the other great works by that other great band. But for the time being, Philip, thank you very much indeed for doing exactly what I wanted, and I wish you well. Look forward to talking to you again soon, and have a great weekend. Thank you very much indeed. Philip Caselli there, cultural historian and a good chum of mine who's up there at Leeds University, and a great guy too. Now, back to the regular stuff, as it were. A bill to change the law on selling drugs to under 16-year-olds will be debated in Parliament later today. Now, intriguing twist to it, it's being led by the North Yorkshire MP Kevin Hollinrake, who in that reshuffle that I was talking to Olivia about earlier on, has actually got a job in government, but he's going to seek to see this through as well, because he's been working very closely with campaigner Kerry Roberts, whose 15-year-old daughter, Leah Hayes, died in 2019 after she took a Class A drug with a group of young friends. The bereaved mum is pushing for a new regulation which would make selling drugs to under 16s a different, tougher offence, attracting an even longer jail term. Anna Riley has this important story.
Leah's Memorial, a place where her mum Kerry can remember her 15-year-old daughter, whose life was tragically cut short. Leah took 2 tablets of MDMA at a park, which within hours had killed her. The drugs were supplied by 2 older teenagers who served 6 months in jail. And ever since, Kerry has been campaigning for Leah's Law to increase sentences for criminals who supply to under 16s.
Leah was full of life. She had so many aspirations. She wanted to do so many things, and her life was wasted. And her life was a waste of a life. And it was because I didn't know things. She didn't know things, and she made a mistake. And with that mistake, she paid with her life. My world ended when she died. I was devastated. I'm still devastated. I think about her every day. And I think about the lady she'd be now. She'd be a young woman. Our kids need protection. They need more protection. It's a law to do other things with under 16s, but not to sell them Class A drugs.
Kevin Hollinrake, MP for Thursk and Malton, has taken on Kerry's plight and hopes that a change in the law could help protect young people from harm.
Supplying drugs to young people is not deemed any more serious offence than dealing drugs to an adult, and that has to be wrong. And so therefore I was very happy to support Kerry's campaign and will continue to do so. There is a much bigger picture here than simply who's dealing drugs to children, but nevertheless, if they are, to my mind, you should face more serious consequences.
As well as petitioning for a change in the law, Kerry's also launched a campaign which encourages parents to talk to their teenagers about the use of drugs and alcohol.
Parents are naive. Our children get this. They get this after school, they get it during school. They can get hold of drugs easily, as easy as ordering a pizza. And it's scary, but it happens. The campaign we're doing is called Not My Child, because every parent thinks, my child wouldn't do that. My daughter, my son wouldn't do that. But it happens.
by protecting others from the pain she felt, Kerry Roberts' fight will not only save lives, but will also keep her daughter's legacy alive. Anna Riley, GB News, Northallerton.
As I said, a really important story. It means a lot to Kevin Hollingrake, but he's a very junior minister now in the reshuffle, but I'm sure he'll want to see that through. Anna Riley reporting upon it now. Moving to royal news now. And as I said right at the beginning, production of the first coins for the new reign and our new king are in circulation after following this sterling work that you can see there. Sterling, no pun intended, at the Royal Mint. Beginning, of course, the transition in terms of branding from Queen Elizabeth II to her son and his reign, and the portrait of the king on the nation's coinage. It has been created to emboss the King's cipher on one side and his own image on the other, and it will appear elsewhere. Cameron Walker, our royal correspondent, joins me in the studio now to talk about that and other matters. A quick take on the coinage, because we're going to be talking to someone from the Royal Mint in just a moment. It's a big deal because it's a big marker in a moment in time, as it were.
Oh, completely. It's the biggest change to UK coinage since decimalisation in the 1970s, Alistair. As you said, one side of a coin will have the new King's face on. The other side is actually in commemoration to Her Majesty the Queen, and it's going to be containing the same design that was put on coins in 1953 to commemorate her coronation, so a nod to her late Majesty. 9.6 million copies of this new 50p coin to mark Her Majesty the Queen's death at the age of 96 will go into circulation from December.
Brilliant. OK, fine. Now, you came in clutching a statement which has that giveaway red crest at the top. Breaking news.
It does. From Buckingham Palace, it's been announced that His Majesty the King is now the Captain General of the Royal Marines on its 358th anniversary. Of course, it was a post held by Prince Harry up until 2021 when he left as a senior working member of the royal family. But perhaps more important is the fact it was held by his father, Prince Philip, for so many years, the King's father, Prince Philip, for so many years. He took up that post the day before the Queen's coronation in 1953. And the King has actually released a statement to the Royal Marines. In a special message, he said, "It is with the greatest possible pleasure to assume the role of your Captain General. I am exceptionally proud to follow in the footsteps of so many members of my family over the last 3.5 centuries, all of whom have held the role with a deep sense of admiration." Now, of course,
let me butt in just for folk who are listening to the conversation on radio, apart from a lovely picture there. Now that, funnily enough, is the King with, I think, Royal Marines looking at the green caps there. But before that was a picture of the King as a prince, a commanding officer of HMS Bronington, which was fishery patrol involved in the Cod War. I mean, he's a proper, there he is in all of his lovely regalia, but he was a proper serving seaman.
He was. He started his Royal Naval career in 1972. He followed in the footsteps of his father and grandfather as well. He served on the guided missile destroyer HMS Norfolk as well. He qualified as a helicopter pilot as well in the 1970s. So he has done it. He's also been on a 9-month tour. I think his last, as you just mentioned, Alistair, his last 9 months in the Royal Navy was taking command of the coastal minehunter HMS Bronington.
Minehunter, my mistake, but I do remember it being involved in the Cod War. You've got final 15 seconds, and that is to underline folk at home who will be looking this up if they're interested in it, that the Royal Marines decision is big because it nods to Harry and it nods to the late Duke of Edinburgh.
It's huge. It's a long line of members of the royal family who have taken up this position. There were rumours perhaps it would be Princess Anne, the Princess Royal, to take up the position, given the fact she is so involved in the Royal Navy, but clearly it's now the King.
Brilliant. Cameron, thank you for that. I'm sure that you'll be doing more on it as the day unfolds, but for now, thank you very much indeed. Always a pleasure to see you. Cameron Walker there, our royal correspondent, with both the new coinage but also the crucial decision having just been made by His Majesty the King to be the boss man of the Royal Marines. Now let's, as promised, go back to that new coinage, and I'm delighted to be joined by the Director of Collector Services at the Royal Mint. There she is, Rebecca Morgan. Rebecca, great to see you. Royal Collectors, what have you, but one step back. these things, as Cameron was just making clear, whether it's the coinage, which is your bit, or stamps that are yet to come and insignia on red boxes for ministers and what have you, there are really important decisions that have to be made about the face that is chosen of the king and the insignia on the reverse of it. Take us through that process.
So when any new design is on a coin, it goes through a rigorous process, and this one is no different, except that it's both sides of the coin that we're talking about here. So when His Majesty the King signed off his effigy, he was presented with the design, and then he agreed that he was happy with it. It was a true likeness, and he was happy for that to be his first official UK effigy, and also, most importantly as well, I think, signed off the reverse of the coin in memorial to Her late Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, his mother.
And I'm going to take that in two bits because I'm genuinely interested, and I think folk listening to our conversation will be as well. First and foremost, I mean, it's a little bit like a lovely photograph that's taken of you or me in a series of them. Clearly, as the subject of it, you can say, yes, I like that one, I don't like that one quite so much. So would you and your design team have gone to Clarence House or Buckingham Palace and said, Your Majesty, these are the 4 or 5 that we think we've narrowed it down to, but you yourself choose, sir?
So we actually made a sculpture from photographs that we knew that His Majesty approved of, and then we put it in front of His Majesty in a sculpture format, first of all, so he could see clearly, bigger than a coin, what it would look like, and with very few changes, very minor, just sort of accentuations. The King was really happy with it. So I think, the Royal Mint has been doing this for 1100 years. We've changed the monarch lots of times. We just haven't changed one for 70 years. So we are quite used to this. I regularly depict royals on coins for anniversaries and birthdays. So we've got a good feel for the kind of effigy the King would be happy with.
I think traditions that are over 1,000 years old are normally quite good traditions, and beautifully batted that question there. While you were talking there at the very end, we saw the Mint operating, and clearly, there's an industrial dimension to it. You're producing huge amounts of coinage for us as well. But when I introduced you, I underlined the point of collector services. I mean, we as a country like to get it right because he's our king, but presumably you've got an army of customers who can't wait for a new coin to come out and look forward to collecting them.
Absolutely. I mean, coins mark a moment in history, and that's why there are so many people who collect coins, and that is why this is such an exciting day. Not only are we seeing a new monarch in our change, but for the first time in 70 years, we're seeing a new monarch in our change. And as already said, decimalisation was the last time. So anybody under 50 will never have seen more than Queen Elizabeth II in their change. Anyone over 50 will remember co-circulating monarchs. But anyone under 50, this will be a huge change for them. And the first of anything is always really collectible. And like I said, a significant day in history, and I'm sure everybody will be checking their change from December to see if they've got one of these firsts.
Absolutely. Final point, and you may have to say pass on it, but I'll ask you anyway. We all know that from halfpennies all the way up to £2 coins and the rest of it, there's a big collection within the collection of our coinage. Have you got a timescale for the next one, and what can we look forward to seeing?
So they will come in line with demand. So as demand for denominations comes in and they need to be put into circulation, that's when you'll start to see the new ones. But probably next year you'll start to see more denominations. Right now there's demand for 50p's, which is good timing, because I think it's fantastic that the first coin of King Charles III is a nod to Her late Majesty and her fantastic reign.
Well, Rebecca, thank you for your time, and through you, thanks to your brilliant team at the Royal Mint for the work that they've been doing over the last 1,200 years, I think you said. Great stuff there. So that was Rebecca there, who is the Director of Collectors, Rebecca Morgan, Director of Collectors.